bleeding woman, 7 terrified children, and a stranger with a rifle pointed at her chest. On the coldest night Montana had seen in 20 years, rancher Elias McCord walked into his barn expecting thieves. What he found instead would haunt him forever, or save him completely. She was dying. The children were starving. And somewhere in the darkness, a killer was already riding toward them. Stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The wind came first. It swept down from the Beartooth Mountains like something angry, something with teeth, tearing across the open rangeland of southeastern Montana with a fury that made even the hardiest cattle turn their backs and huddle together for warmth. The year was 1887, and winter had arrived 3 weeks early with the kind of vengeance that old-timers would talk about for decades afterward, if they survived it. Elias McCord stood at the frost-covered window of his cabin, watching the snow pile against the fence posts until they disappeared entirely. The glass was so cold it burned his fingertips when he touched it, and his breath formed small clouds that crystallized almost instantly against the pane. Behind him, the fire crackled and popped in the stone hearth, the only sound in a house that had grown far too quiet over the past 2 years. He was 43 years old, though he looked older. The sun and wind of Montana had carved deep lines into his face, and grief had added a few more. His hair, once the color of wheat at harvest time, was now streaked heavily with gray, and his blue eyes, the eyes his late wife Margaret had once called summer sky eyes, had faded to something closer to winter ice. The clock on the mantel read 10:30 when he heard it. At first, Elias thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. Sound traveled strangely during storms like this, bouncing off snowdrifts and frozen trees, creating echoes where none should exist. He turned away from the window, reaching for the cup of coffee that had long since gone cold on the table. Then he heard it again. A crack. Sharp. Unmistakable. That wasn't wind. That wasn't a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. That was gunfire. Elias moved without thinking, grabbing his Winchester rifle from above the fireplace and shrugging into the heavy buffalo hide coat that hung by the door. His boots were still warm from sitting near the fire, and he was grateful for that small mercy as he stepped out into the howling darkness. The cold hit him like a physical blow. 20 below zero at least, maybe colder. The kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. The kind that froze the moisture in your nose and made your lungs ache with every breath. Snow swirled around him in thick curtains, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. Another shot cracked through the night, and this time Elias could tell it came from the direction of his barn, a massive structure some 200 yards from the main house, built to shelter livestock during exactly this kind of brutal Montana winter. Hunters, he muttered to himself, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't make sense. No hunter worth his salt would be out in weather like this, and certainly not firing shots in the middle of the night. He pushed through the drifts, the snow already up past his knees in places, his rifle held ready across his chest. The wind screamed in his ears, drowning out any other sound, and for several terrifying minutes he moved blind, navigating only by memory and instinct toward where he knew the barn should be. When he finally reached the massive doors, he paused. Something was wrong. The doors were slightly ajar, not enough to let the wind tear them open, but enough to tell him someone had been here. Someone was still here. He could see the faintest flicker of light through the crack, wavering like a candle flame fighting to survive. Elias raised his rifle and kicked the door open. What he saw in that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the far corner of the barn, huddled between bales of hay that provided meager shelter from the cold, was a woman. She was young, early 30s perhaps, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in frozen tangles around a face that was pale as bone. Her dress, once blue, was torn and stained with something dark that Elias recognized immediately. Blood. A lot of blood. But it wasn't the woman that made his heart stop in his chest. It was the children. 7 of them, ranging in age from what looked like 3 or 4 years old to a gangly boy of perhaps 13. They were pressed against the woman like a litter of puppies seeking warmth from their mother, their eyes wide with terror, their faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. Every single one of them was shaking, from cold, from fear, or from both. And the woman, Despite the blood soaking through her dress, despite the way her left arm hung uselessly at her side, despite the fact that she was clearly moments from collapse, had positioned her body between the children and the door, between the children and him. In her right hand, she held a pistol. It was pointed directly at his chest. "Stay back," she said, and her voice cracked with the effort of speaking. "Stay back, or I swear to God I'll kill you." Elias didn't move. He'd seen fear before, seen it in the eyes of cattle during stampedes, seen it in the faces of men during the war, seen it in his own reflection during the long months after Margaret died. But what he saw in this woman's eyes went beyond fear. This was the look of someone who had already decided to die and was determined to take her killer with her. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and calm, the way he would with a spooked horse. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." "That's what he said," the woman whispered. "That's exactly what he said. I don't know who he is, ma'am, but I'm not him. My name is Elias McCord. This is my barn. This is my ranch, and you're bleeding all over my hay." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside and the ragged breathing of 7 terrified children. The woman's gun hand trembled, whether from weakness or cold or both, and Elias could see her fighting to keep it steady. "You could be working for him," she said. "You could be one of his men. I'm not working for anyone. It's just me here. Just me, and about 60 head of cattle that are going to be pretty upset if you bleed out in their barn." It was a strange thing to say. He knew that even as the words left his mouth, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes the unexpected could break through fear when nothing else could. And sure enough, something shifted in the woman's eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something. "If you're going to shoot me," Elias continued slowly, "at least let me put down my rifle first. Seems only fair." He didn't wait for her answer. Moving with exaggerated care, he bent and placed the Winchester on the frozen ground, then straightened up with his hands raised slightly, palms out. "There," he said. "Now you've got all the guns and I've got nothing. Feel better?" The woman's arm sagged, the pistol dropping a few inches before she caught herself and raised it again. But the effort cost her. Elias could see it in the way her face went even paler, in the way her whole body swayed. "Mama," one of the children whispered, a little girl, couldn't have been more than 5, with blonde hair that was matted with dirt and something that might have been blood. "Mama, I'm cold." The woman glanced down at the child, and in that moment of distraction, Elias saw the wound clearly for the first time, high on her left shoulder near the collarbone. A bullet wound, and one that had been left untreated for what looked like at least a day, maybe longer. The flesh around it was swollen and angry red, the edges of the wound crusted with dried blood and, God help her, the greenish tinge of infection. If she didn't get help soon, she was going to die. Probably before morning. "She's not your mama, is she?" Elias asked quietly, nodding toward the little blonde girl. The woman's jaw tightened. "She's mine now. They all are." "How long since you've eaten? Any of you?" No answer. But the way the children's eyes fixed on him at the mention of food told him everything he needed to know. "There's a fire in my cabin," Elias said. "Warm beds. I've got venison stew that's been simmering all day and bread that I baked this morning. It's not much, but it's hot, and there's plenty of it." "Why would you help us?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper now. "You don't know us. You don't know what we've done. I know you're bleeding. I know those children are starving. And I know that whatever you're running from, you won't outrun it if you're dead." The pistol wavered again, and this time it dropped to her side. She didn't seem to have the strength to raise it anymore. "He's coming," she said. "He'll find us. He always finds us." "Who?" "My brother-in-law, Caleb Rowe." The name meant nothing to Elias, but the terror in her voice said everything. "Is he the one who shot you?" A single nod. "Then here's what's going to happen," Elias said, and now his voice carried a different kind of authority, the authority of a man who had survived war and loss and the brutal indifference of the Montana wilderness. "You're going to let me help you to my cabin. We're going to get those children fed and warm, and then we're going to deal with that wound before it kills you. And if this Caleb Rowe shows up on my land, he's going to learn that there are some things in Montana more dangerous than a man with a grudge." "You don't understand," the woman said. He's got a bounty on me, $50. Every man between here and Billings is looking for me. Then it's a good thing I'm not every man. He stepped forward slowly, carefully, making sure she could see his every move. When he reached her, he could feel the heat radiating from her feverish skin, even through the cold. She was burning up from the inside while freezing from the outside, and he had no idea how she was still conscious, let alone standing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Rowe." "Well, Lydia Rowe, I'm going to pick you up now. Try not to shoot me." She might have laughed, or it might have been a sob. Either way, when he lifted her into his arms, she didn't resist. She weighed almost nothing, which terrified him. She felt fragile as bird bones, as if she might shatter if he held her too tightly. "Children," he said, turning to face the 7 small faces watching him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Can you walk?" The oldest boy, the gangly one, probably 13, stepped forward. He had dark eyes that had seen too much, and when he spoke, his voice was steady in a way that no child's voice should be. "We can walk," he said. "We've walked for 100 miles. We can walk a little more. What's your name, son?" "Thomas. Thomas Wheeler." "Thomas, I need you to take the little one's hands and follow me. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good man." The journey back to the cabin was brutal. The wind had picked up even more, and the snow was falling so thick and fast that Elias couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. Lydia had lost consciousness almost immediately after he picked her up, which was probably a mercy. Moving her must have been agony. He could feel fresh blood seeping through his coat from where her wound pressed against his chest. Behind him, he could hear the children struggling through the drifts, their breathing harsh and labored. Thomas kept them moving, urging them forward, telling the younger ones that there was food waiting, warm food. They just had to keep walking, just a little more. "Come on, you can do it." When Elias finally shouldered open the door of his cabin, he was half frozen himself, and his arms were shaking with the effort of carrying Lydia's dead weight through the storm. He laid her down on the rug before the fire as gently as he could manage, then turned to usher the children inside. They came in like ghosts, silent, wide-eyed, trembling. Most of them had never seen a house this size, Elias realized. Most of them had probably never been warm in their lives. "Shut the door, Thomas," he said. "Bar it behind you." The boy obeyed without question, and the howl of the wind was immediately muffled, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of 7 children trying to remember how to feel safe. Elias turned his attention back to Lydia. Her face was gray now, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he carefully pulled back the bloodied fabric of her dress to examine the wound, what he saw made his stomach turn. The infection had spread further than he'd thought. Red lines were beginning to radiate outward from the wound, the first signs of blood poisoning. If he didn't act fast, nothing he did would matter. "Thomas," he said without looking up, "can you find the kitchen? There's a pot on the stove with stew in it, and bowls in the cupboard. Get everyone fed. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. And on the shelf above the stove, there's a bottle of whiskey. Bring that to me. And clean rags. There should be some in the drawer by the sink, hot water too, if the kettle's still warm." The boy moved quickly, efficiently, and Elias felt a surge of gratitude for his competence. He didn't have time to worry about the children right now. He had to focus on keeping Lydia alive. The next hour was the longest of Elias's life. He worked by firelight and instinct, drawing on skills he hadn't used since the war. The bullet was still in there. He could feel it when he probed the wound, a hard lump of metal that had lodged itself against her collarbone. It needed to come out. The infection needed to be drained, and he needed to do it all without proper tools, without anesthetic, without anything but whiskey and hot water and prayers he wasn't sure he still believed in. Lydia woke up screaming when he started. He'd hoped she wouldn't, hoped the fever would keep her unconscious, but the pain tore through even that, and her eyes flew open with a wild, desperate terror that nearly broke his heart. "Hold her," he said to Thomas, who had returned with the supplies and was now standing frozen by the fire, watching with horror. "Hold her arms. Don't let her move." "I can't." "You can. You have to. If she moves while I'm doing this, she'll die. Do you understand?" Thomas understood. He knelt beside Lydia's head and pressed her shoulders to the ground, his young face set in grim determination. I'm sorry, Elias whispered to her. I'm so sorry, but I have to do this. Just do it, she gasped. Just do it. He did. The bullet came out along with a gush of infected blood and pus that made even the children look away. Lydia screamed again, her whole body convulsing against Thomas's grip, and then, mercifully, she passed out again. Elias worked quickly after that, draining the wound, cleaning it with whiskey that he was reasonably sure would do nothing but hurt like hell, packing it with clean cloth. When he was finished, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely tie off the bandage. Will she live? It was Thomas, his voice small and scared for the first time since they'd arrived. Elias sat back on his heels, exhausted. I don't know, he said honestly. The next few hours will tell. She has to live. She's the only one who... The boy trailed off, his composure finally cracking. She's the only one who came back for us. What do you mean? Thomas looked at the other children, who were huddled together near the kitchen, eating stew with the single-minded focus of those who don't know when their next meal will come. Some of us, we had families, he said quietly. Had them. They died. Fever, mostly. Some from the hunger. Lydia, she was traveling with her husband when they found us. Her husband, Samuel, he wanted to keep going, but Lydia, she couldn't leave us behind. She couldn't leave any of us behind. Where's Samuel now? Dead. The word was flat, empty. Caleb killed him, shot him in the back when he wouldn't hand over Lydia. Called it an accident, said Samuel drew on him first, but we all saw. We all saw. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. When was this? 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. We've been running ever since. Caleb, he's got money, he's got men, he's got the law on his side. Everyone thinks Lydia killed her husband. That's what Caleb told them. That's why there's a bounty. And the truth? The truth doesn't matter, Thomas said bitterly. Not to men like Caleb Rowe. Elias looked down at the unconscious woman on his floor. This stranger who had taken in orphans she didn't have to save, who had kept running even with a bullet in her shoulder, who had been ready to die in a frozen barn rather than let anyone hurt the children she'd claimed as her own. The truth doesn't matter. Something stirred in Elias's chest, something that had been dormant for 2 years, since the day they lowered Margaret into the cold Montana ground, and he'd decided that the world could go on without him. It matters to me, he said. The fever broke just before dawn. Elias had been sitting beside Lydia all night, keeping the fire stoked, changing her bandages, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips whenever she surfaced briefly from unconsciousness. The children had finally fallen asleep, most of them piled together in his bedroom like a litter of puppies, with Thomas keeping watch from a chair by the door. When Lydia's eyes opened, they were clearer than they had been before. The wild terror was gone, replaced by exhaustion and something that might have been confusion. Where... she started, then winced as the movement pulled at her wound. Don't move, Elias said. You're safe. You're in my cabin. The children are asleep in the other room. She tried to sit up anyway, and he pressed a gentle hand to her good shoulder to keep her down. Thomas? He's fine. They're all fine. Sleeping for the first time in what looks like weeks. Lydia closed her eyes, and for a moment Elias thought she'd passed out again. But then a tear slid from beneath her closed lids, tracking down her hollow cheek, and he realized she was crying. You should have left us, she whispered. You should have just left us. Maybe, but I didn't. Why? It was the same question she'd asked in the barn, and Elias still didn't have a good answer. He thought about it for a long moment, watching the fire crackle and pop, watching the snow pile up outside the window, watching this stranger who had crashed into his life like a meteorite and upended everything he'd thought he knew about himself. My wife died 2 years ago, he said finally. Margaret. She was everything to me. When she passed, I promised myself I'd never let anyone else down, never let anyone else die when I could have done something. He paused, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for far too long. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you. Lydia opened her eyes again, and there was something new in them now, something that looked almost like hope. Caleb will come, she said. He'll find out we're here. He always finds out. Let him come. You don't know what he's capable of. Maybe not, but he doesn't know what I'm capable of either. They stayed like that for a while, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised them both. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, there was warmth. There was safety. There was, for the first time in weeks, the possibility of something that felt almost like peace. It wouldn't last. They both knew that. But for now, for this one moment, it was enough. The morning brought the first glimpse of the sun in 3 days, along with a knocking at the door that made Lydia go pale as death. Elias grabbed his rifle before answering, but when he cracked the door open, he found not a band of bounty hunters, but a single woman, elderly, sharp-eyed, and dressed in black from head to toe. "Miss Walker," he said, not quite managing to keep the surprise from his voice. Prudence Walker was the unofficial moral authority of the nearest town, a settlement called Reed's Crossing about 8 miles to the north. She was 67 years old, had never married, and had opinions about everything, most of them disapproving. She also had the most reliable network of gossip in 3 counties. "Mr. McCord," she said, pushing past him into the cabin before he could stop her, "I heard the most distressing rumors in town this morning, and She stopped dead. Lydia was sitting up now, propped against the side of the settee, her bandaged shoulder visible through the torn remnants of her dress. And scattered around the room were 7 children in various states of waking, their thin faces turned toward the intruder with expressions ranging from curiosity to fear. "Good heavens," Miss Walker breathed. "It's true." "Miss Walker, there's a woman living in your cabin, Mr. McCord, an unmarried woman with children." "She was shot, Miss Walker. She's injured. The children were starving. And so you simply took them in without a thought for propriety? Without a thought for what the town will say?" Elias felt his jaw tighten. "I wasn't thinking about the town. I was thinking about keeping them alive. There are processes for these things. Churches, orphanages, authorities who would hand those children over to the man who shot this woman." Elias's voice was cold now, the voice of a man who had reached the limit of his patience. Authorities who would believe a liar with money over a wounded woman with nothing. Is that what you'd prefer, Miss Walker? Prudence Walker's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. It was, perhaps, the first time in her life that she'd been rendered speechless. "This woman," Elias continued, "has been running for weeks with a bullet in her shoulder and 7 children depending on her. She didn't ask for my help. She was ready to die in my barn rather than risk anyone hurting these kids. And I'm not going to let some small-minded gossip about propriety stop me from doing what's right." "Mr. McCord, I think you should leave now, Miss Walker." The silence that followed was charged with something electric. Prudence Walker drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't much, and fixed Elias with a look that had cowed men twice his size. "This isn't over," she said. "The town will hear about this. The sheriff will hear about this. And when the truth comes out about that woman and whatever it is she's running from, I'm running from the man who murdered my husband." The voice was weak but steady, and everyone turned to look at Lydia. She had pushed herself fully upright now, her face pale from the effort, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that seemed impossible given her condition. "My name is Lydia Rowe. My husband was Samuel Rowe, and his brother Caleb killed him, shot him in the back while he was protecting me and these children from being separated and sold off like cattle. Caleb claims I'm the killer because that's what men like him do. They lie. They use their money and their power to twist the truth until no one can remember what really happened. And the only reason I'm still alive is because this man," she nodded toward Elias, "saw something worth saving in a barn full of strangers." Miss Walker's face had gone through several transformations during this speech, from outrage to shock to something that might have been uncertainty. "I've heard a different story," she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "I'm sure you have. Caleb's been spreading his version for weeks, but I have 7 children who saw the truth, 7 witnesses who watched a man gun down his own brother because he wanted what his brother had. Are you going to believe a murderer, Miss Walker? Or are you going to believe the people who were there?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Prudence Walker looked at the children, at Thomas, who met her gaze without flinching, at the little blonde girl who had crept close to Lydia and was now clutching her hand, at the others, thin and scared but alive. Alive because of this woman, alive because of this man. Something shifted in her expression. "The sheriff will need to hear this," she said finally. "The whole story, properly." "Then send for him," Elias said. "But until then, these people are under my protection, and anyone who tries to take them, anyone, is going to have to go through me first." Miss Walker held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll be back," she said, "with the sheriff." She turned and left without another word, letting in a blast of cold air before the door swung shut behind her. Elias released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking slightly from the confrontation. He turned to find Lydia watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did." "Why?" He thought about the question, thought about Margaret, about the promises he'd made and broken, about the long years of silence and solitude and grief. Thought about this woman and these children who had stumbled into his life like a gift from a god he'd almost stopped believing in. "Because you were worth defending," he said. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Lydia's wound healed slowly but steadily, thanks to Elias's rough doctoring and her own stubborn will to survive. The children settled into the cabin like they'd always been there, Thomas taking charge of the younger ones, making sure they ate and washed and didn't get underfoot, while the little blonde girl, whose name was Emma, Elias learned, attached herself to Lydia with a devotion that was almost painful to witness. Elias found himself adapting to the chaos with surprising ease. He'd spent 2 years rattling around this cabin alone, letting it grow dusty and silent and cold. Now it was filled with noise, with children's laughter and arguments, and the constant patter of small feet. It should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey he hadn't known he'd been on. "You're good with them," Lydia said one evening, watching him help young Matthew, a quiet boy of about 8 with a shock of red hair, practice his letters by the fire. "Better than you think." Elias looked up, startled. "Margaret and we always wanted children. It never happened." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. That was a different life." He set down the chalk they'd been using to mark on a slate. "What about you? You said some of these children aren't yours." "None of them are. Not by blood." Lydia's voice was quiet but steady. "Samuel and I found Thomas first, in a ditch outside of Bozeman, more dead than alive. His whole family had been taken by cholera. Then the others, one by one. Emma's mother died in childbirth. Marcus's father was a miner who never came back from a cave-in. The twins," she nodded toward 2 identical girls about 10 years old, "were being beaten by the people who were supposed to be caring for them. And little Peter, we found Peter wandering alone on the prairie. He couldn't even tell us his own name." "So you just took them all?" "What else could I do? Leave them to die? Let them be sold off to whoever would pay for the labor." Lydia's jaw tightened. "Samuel's family has money, old money, the kind that thinks it can do anything it wants. Caleb, he had plans for these children, plans that made me sick to even think about. So when Samuel said we were taking them west to start fresh, I didn't argue. I didn't care about the money, or the land, or any of it. I just wanted them safe. And now Samuel's dead. And now Samuel's dead. And Caleb wants them back. Not because he cares about them. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. But because they're his property now, in his mind. His brother's property, and Caleb Rowe has never let go of anything that belonged to him." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not as fierce as the night they'd arrived, but steady, insistent, a reminder that winter was far from over. "He'll come," he said finally. "You know that." "I know." "And when he does?" Lydia met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not desperation, but a kind of steel determination that reminded him of women he'd known during the war. Women who had held farms together while their husbands fought and died. Women who had buried their children and kept going. Women who had faced the worst the world could offer and refused to break. "When he comes," she said. "I'll be ready." The sheriff arrived 3 days later. Alden Brooks was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a silver star pinned to his chest and eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything. He rode up to Elias's cabin at mid-morning with 2 deputies and Miss Prudence Walker, who looked considerably less hostile than she had during her previous visit. Elias met them at the door, his rifle visible but not raised. "Sheriff?" "McCord." Brooks swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the packed snow. "Heard you've got some interesting guests." "That's one way to put it." "Mind if I come in? It's colder than a witch's heart out here." Elias stepped aside and the sheriff entered alone, leaving his deputies and Miss Walker outside. His eyes swept the room quickly, noting the children, noting Lydia, noting the way Thomas immediately moved to position himself between the lawman and the younger kids. "So," Brooks said, "you'd be Lydia Rowe." Lydia stood, her arm still in a sling, but her posture straight and unafraid. "I would. I've got a warrant for your arrest, signed by a judge in Billings. Murder charges, it says. Murder of your husband, Samuel Rowe. Those charges are lies." "Maybe. Maybe not." Brooks pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I've also got $50 in bounty money that says I should haul you back to face trial. And Caleb Rowe's got another 100 waiting if I bring him proof you've been dealt with." The room went very still. "So what are you going to do?" Elias asked quietly, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. Brooks looked at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he sighed. "Miss Walker came to see me," he said. "Told me a story different from the one I'd heard. Made me curious. So I did some digging." He tucked the warrant back into his coat. "Talked to a few people who were in the area when Samuel Rowe died. Talked to a preacher who passed through. Talked to a woman at a trading post who saw the whole thing. And they all say the same thing, that Caleb Rowe shot his brother in cold blood, and that woman there was already wounded when it happened." Lydia's breath caught. "You believe them?" "I believe enough of them." Brooks walked to the fire, warming his hands over the flames. "Problem is, Caleb Rowe's got friends in high places. Judges, politicians, people who owe him favors. He's not going to let this go just because some small-town sheriff has questions." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest you get ready for a fight." Brooks turned to face them both, his expression grim. "Because Caleb Rowe's already in Reed's Crossing. Arrived yesterday with 6 men, and he's not bothering to hide what he's here for. He wants the woman. He wants those children. And he's made it clear he'll kill anyone who gets in his way." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elias looked at Lydia, at this woman he'd known for barely a week, this stranger who had become something more than a stranger almost without his noticing. Her face was pale but set, her eyes bright with a fury that seemed to burn from within. "Let him come," she said. And somehow, despite everything, Elias believed her. Well, the confrontation came sooner than any of them expected. It was late afternoon when they heard the horses, not 1 or 2, but many, the thunder of hooves cutting through the cold afternoon air like a warning. Elias had been chopping wood behind the cabin, and he dropped the axe immediately, racing for the front door. "Inside!" he shouted to Thomas, who had been teaching the younger children to build a snowman. "Everyone inside, now!" They moved fast. They'd practiced this. In the days since the sheriff's visit, Elias had drilled them on what to do if Caleb came. Hide. Stay quiet. Don't come out until someone they trusted told them it was safe. By the time the riders crested the hill, Elias was standing on his porch with his Winchester, and Lydia was beside him with her recovered pistol. There were 7 of them. 6 wore the rough clothing of hired guns, men whose eyes held the emptiness of those who killed for money and didn't lose sleep over it. But the seventh was different. Caleb Rowe sat his horse like a man born to the saddle, his expensive coat immaculate despite the cold, his gloved hands resting easily on the pommel. He was handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, dark hair, sharp features, eyes the color of winter ice. He looked like Samuel might have looked, Elias realized, if Samuel had been carved from stone instead of flesh. "Mr. McCord," Caleb's voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly without warmth. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. Nothing on this land belongs to you. The woman does. And the children. Caleb smiled, and the expression made Elias's skin crawl. My brother's widow and my brother's wards. The law says they're my responsibility now. I'm just here to take them home. Your brother's dead because you killed him. Now that's an interesting accusation. Caleb didn't seem bothered by it at all, particularly given that I have a warrant for Lydia's arrest on murder charges. The judge believed my version of events. So did the sheriff in Billings. So will the jury, if it comes to that. The sheriff here believes different. Alden Brooks? Caleb laughed, a short, humorless sound. Brooks is a small-town lawman with delusions of relevance. He won't matter in the end. None of this will matter. His eyes shifted to Lydia. Come now, sister. Let's end this nonsense. You're wounded, you're tired, and you're running out of options. Come with me peacefully, and I'll see to it that the children are taken care of. The way you took care of Samuel? Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, something dark and dangerous. Samuel made his choice. He chose you and those worthless orphans over his own family, over his own blood. He got what he deserved. He deserved better than to be shot in the back by his own brother. And yet here we are. Caleb's smile returned, colder than before. I'm done talking, Lydia. You have 1 minute to come down from that porch, or my men will burn this cabin to the ground with everyone inside. Your choice. Elias raised his rifle. You want her? You go through me first. That can be arranged. One of the hired guns started to raise his weapon, and a shot rang out. Not from Elias, not from Caleb's men, from somewhere behind them. Everyone froze. Slowly, Caleb turned in his saddle to find Sheriff Alden Brooks mounted on his own horse, a smoking pistol in his hand. Behind him were not 2 deputies, but a dozen men. Townspeople, Elias realized. Men from Reed's Crossing. Men who'd heard the story and chosen a side. And standing among them, wrapped in a heavy coat and carrying a Bible like a shield, was an elderly man with white hair and eyes that blazed with righteous fury. Caleb Rowe, the old man said, his voice carrying with the power of someone used to being heard. I saw you murder your brother. I watched you shoot him in the back while he tried to protect that woman and those children. I've held my tongue because I was afraid, because you have money and power and friends in high places. But I will not stand silent anymore. Pastor Hart, Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm. I don't know what lies you've been told. No lies. Only truth. And there are others here who saw the same thing, others who were too afraid to speak until now. The pastor gestured to the men behind him. But we're not afraid anymore, Caleb. We're done letting you use your money to buy your way out of justice. We're done watching you hurt people and call it law. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Caleb's face. His eyes swept over the assembled townspeople, counting them, weighing the odds, calculating his options. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is. Sheriff Brooks nudged his horse forward. Caleb Rowe, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Rowe. Surrender your weapons and come peacefully, or we'll take you by force. The moment stretched like wire about to snap. Then one of Caleb's hired guns went for his weapon, and the world exploded into chaos. Shots rang out, horses screamed, men shouted and fell, and blood stained the white snow red. Elias fired and kept firing, his rifle kicking against his shoulder, while Lydia emptied her pistol into the melee with deadly accuracy. When the smoke cleared, 4 of Caleb's men were dead, and 2 more were wounded. Caleb himself was on the ground, disarmed, with Sheriff Brooks's boot on his chest and a gun pointed at his head. I said surrender, Brooks growled. Caleb laughed, a broken, bitter sound. You have no idea what you've done. I have friends. Your friends aren't here, and when word spreads about what really happened to your brother, I don't think they'll be your friends much longer. Brooks hauled him to his feet. Caleb Rowe, you're under arrest, and this time, justice isn't for sale. The aftermath was quiet. Elias stood on the porch as they led Caleb away, watching until the last horse disappeared over the hill. Beside him, Lydia was trembling, not from cold, but from the release of months of terror. It's over, she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. It's really over. Not yet, Elias said gently. There'll still be a trial, testimony, all of that. But we'll face it together? The question was small, vulnerable, so different from the steel-spined woman who had pointed a gun at him in his own barn a week ago. And yet somehow, hearing her ask it, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been frozen for 2 years slowly beginning to thaw. "Together," he said. Behind them, the door creaked open, and 7 small faces peered out, frightened and hopeful and waiting to see if the world was finally safe. Lydia turned to them, and despite everything, despite the wound that was still healing, despite the tears tracking down her face, despite all the horrors she'd survived, she smiled. "It's okay," she said. "We're okay. We're home." And as Elias watched her gather those children into her arms, he realized that for the first time in 2 years, he believed that was true. The silence that followed Caleb's arrest was strange and terrible. For 3 days, no one came to the ranch. No riders appeared on the horizon. No shots echoed across the frozen landscape. The wind still howled down from the mountains, and the snow still fell in thick curtains that buried the fence posts and made the world feel small and closed in. But there was a different quality to the quiet now. Not the tense, waiting silence of prey hiding from a predator, but something gentler. Something that felt almost like peace. Elias didn't trust it. He'd learned long ago that peace was a temporary thing, a brief respite between storms, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still coming. Caleb Rowe was in the Reeds Crossing jail, but Caleb Rowe had money and influence and friends in places that a small-town sheriff couldn't reach. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Still, there was work to be done. The morning after the confrontation, Elias woke before dawn as he always did, his body conditioned by decades of ranching to rise with the first gray light of approaching day. But this morning was different. This morning, when he padded out of his small bedroom toward the main room of the cabin, he found that he was not alone. Lydia was sitting by the fire, her wounded arm still in its sling, her face pale and drawn in the flickering light. She hadn't heard him approach. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, and there was something in her expression that made Elias's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You should be resting," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and he saw that she'd been crying. The tracks of tears still glistened on her cheeks, though her eyes were dry now, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. Samuel, I mean. The way he looked when he fell. The way the blood spread across the snow." She paused, her jaw tightening. "I keep thinking about all the things I should have done differently, all the ways I could have saved him." Elias crossed to the fire and lowered himself into the chair beside her. His bones ached from the cold. They always did these days, and he took a moment to let the warmth seep into him before he spoke. "You can't save everyone, Lydia. God knows I've learned that lesson hard enough. But he was my husband. He trusted me to To what? Stop a bullet with your bare hands? See into the future and know that Caleb would choose that moment to turn murderer?" Elias shook his head. "Samuel died protecting you and those children. That was his choice. Don't dishonor it by pretending you could have made it for him." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped, sending up small showers of sparks that danced briefly in the air before dying. "How do you do it?" she asked finally. "How do you live with it? The guilt, the grief, all of it?" "I don't know that I do. Not well anyway." Elias stared into the flames, remembering. "When Margaret died, I wanted to die too. Came close a few times, but then I'd wake up in the morning, and the cattle would need feeding, and the fences would need mending, and somehow the work kept me going even when I didn't want to be kept going." He paused. "I suppose that's the secret, if there is one. You just keep moving forward, one day at a time, until the weight of it gets a little lighter. It never goes away completely, but it gets lighter. And if it doesn't, then you find something worth carrying it for." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not just a wounded woman running from a murderer, but someone who had already survived things that would have broken most people. Someone who had kept 7 children alive through hunger and cold and violence. Someone who had faced death in his barn and refused to surrender. "Those children," he said, "they're worth carrying it for. You know that as well as I do." Lydia's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she was smiling now, a small, fragile thing, but real. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving us, for standing up to Caleb, for... She trailed off, shaking her head. I don't even know how to thank you properly. You don't have to thank me. Just get some rest. We've got a long road ahead. She nodded, but she didn't move from her chair, and after a moment, Elias realized she didn't want to be alone. So he stayed where he was, watching the fire, and together they sat in comfortable silence as the first light of dawn began to creep across the frozen landscape outside. The children woke gradually over the next hour, emerging from the bedroom in ones and twos like small, sleepy ghosts. Thomas was first, as always. The boy had taken on the role of protector so completely that Elias sometimes forgot he was only 13. He checked on each of the younger children with quiet efficiency, making sure they were dressed warmly, making sure they hadn't kicked off their blankets in the night. Then came the twins, Rachel and Rebecca, who were so identical that Elias still couldn't tell them apart half the time. They moved in perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a private language of glances and gestures that no one else could quite decode. Marcus was next, a sturdy boy of 9 with dark skin and darker eyes that held a wariness born of too many disappointments. He'd been the hardest to reach, Elias had noticed, the most suspicious of kindness. But even Marcus had started to thaw over the past few days, had started looking at Elias with something other than distrust. Little Emma came running out as soon as she was awake, making a beeline for Lydia with the single-minded devotion that had characterized her from the beginning. She climbed into Lydia's lap without asking permission, tucking her blonde head under Lydia's chin and wrapping her small arms around Lydia's waist. "Good morning, sweetheart," Lydia murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Emma's head. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about horses," Emma said seriously. "Big ones, brown ones. They were running and I was running with them." "That sounds like a wonderful dream. Can I have a horse someday?" Lydia's eyes met Elias's over Emma's head, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of all the uncertain futures that lay ahead. "Maybe someday," Lydia said. "We'll have to wait and see." Matthew shuffled out next, the red-haired boy who had been practicing his letters with Elias the night before. He was quiet and serious, prone to long silences and sudden questions that revealed a mind far more active than his demeanor suggested. And finally, little Peter, the youngest at barely 4 years old, the one they'd found wandering alone on the prairie, the one who still sometimes woke screaming from nightmares he couldn't describe. Elias watched them all settle around the cabin's main room, and he was struck by how quickly they'd made this space their own. Just a week ago, this cabin had been a tomb, a monument to grief and loneliness and everything he'd lost when Margaret died. Now it was full of life, full of noise, full of the kind of chaos that he'd once thought he'd never experience. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like something he hadn't even known he was missing. "I'll make breakfast," Thomas announced, already heading for the kitchen. "Mr. McCord, do we have any eggs?" "Check the cold cellar. Should be a few dozen from before the storm." "I'll help," Rachel said. Or was it Rebecca? Elias still couldn't tell. "Me too," her twin added, and the three of them disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the others clustered around the fire. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the movement. "I need to check on the cattle, make sure they weathered the storm all right." "I can come with you," Marcus said quickly, and there was something almost eager in his voice, a hunger for purpose, for usefulness, for the chance to prove himself. "All right, bundle up warm. It's cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth." The boy was ready in minutes, wrapped in one of Elias's old coats that hung past his knees and made him look even younger than he was. Together they stepped out into the brilliant white world of the morning after the storm. The sun was fully up now, blazing off the snow with an intensity that made Elias squint. The sky was impossibly blue, that deep, endless Montana blue that he'd fallen in love with the first time he'd seen it, decades ago now. The ranch spread out before them, the buildings half buried in drifts, the fence posts marking boundaries that the snow had erased. "It's beautiful," Marcus said softly, and there was wonder in his voice, the wonder of a child who'd spent too much of his life in dark places. "It is. Cold as death, but beautiful. Did you build all this yourself?" "Most of it. The cabin was already here when I bought the land, belonged to a trapper who died in a blizzard back in '72. But the barn, the fences, the outbuildings, Margaret and I built all of that together. Margaret was your wife? She was. What happened to her? The question was blunt, almost clinical, the way children's questions often are. Elias was quiet for a moment, his boots crunching in the packed snow as they walked. Fever, he said finally. Came on sudden, the way fevers do out here. One day she was fine, laughing, talking about the garden she wanted to plant in the spring. 3 days later, she was gone. I'm sorry. So am I. They walked in silence after that, making their way to the barn where the cattle had sheltered during the storm. The animals were fine, cold and hungry but alive, and Elias spent the next hour forking hay and breaking ice in the water trough while Marcus watched and learned and asked questions that revealed a quick mind and a genuine interest in the work. Could you teach me? Marcus asked finally, as they were heading back to the cabin. To do all this, I mean. The ranching. I could, if you wanted to learn. I do. The boy's voice was fierce with a conviction that surprised Elias. I want to learn how to do things, real things, things that matter, not just survive. Elias looked at him, this child who'd been beaten and abandoned and left to die by a world that should have protected him, and felt something crack open in his chest. Then I'll teach you, he said, starting tomorrow. Marcus's smile was like sunrise. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Elias would rise early, check on the cattle, tend to the endless chores that kept a ranch running through a Montana winter. Thomas and Marcus usually joined him, learning the work with an eagerness that made up for their inexperience. The twins helped Lydia in the cabin, cooking and cleaning and caring for the younger children. And slowly, gradually, the hollow shell of a house that Elias had lived in for 2 years began to feel like something else entirely. It began to feel like a home. Lydia's wound healed faster than Elias had dared hope. Within a week, she was out of the sling, though the arm was still stiff and weak. Within 2 weeks, she was helping with the household work, her natural competence reasserting itself now that she wasn't running for her life. She organized the cabin with quiet efficiency, creating systems and routines that kept 7 children fed and clothed and occupied without driving anyone to madness. And at night, after the children were asleep, she and Elias would sit by the fire and talk. They talked about everything, their pasts, their fears, their hopes for a future that neither of them quite dared to believe in. Lydia told him about her childhood in Virginia, about meeting Samuel at a church social, about the early years of their marriage when everything seemed possible. Elias told her about the war, about coming west to escape his memories, about finding Margaret and building a life that had ended far too soon. I never thought I'd find anything like that again, he admitted one night, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for too long. After Margaret died, I figured that was it, that I'd used up my share of happiness, and the rest of my life would just be waiting. Waiting for what? To die, I suppose. To join her. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the cabin, and somewhere in the other room, one of the children murmured in their sleep. I know what you mean, she said finally. After Samuel died, after we started running, there were nights I thought about just giving up, just letting Caleb win. The only thing that kept me going was them, the children. They needed me. I couldn't abandon them just because I was tired of fighting. You're braver than you know. I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn. Isn't that the same thing? She laughed at that, a real laugh, full and warm, and Elias felt something shift in his chest, something that had been dormant for 2 years, slowly stirring back to life. He didn't have words for what he was feeling, didn't know if he wanted words for it. All he knew was that this woman and these children had crashed into his life like a meteor, and nothing would ever be the same again. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a knock at the door. It was mid-morning, about 3 weeks after Caleb's arrest, and Elias was helping Matthew with his arithmetic at the kitchen table while Lydia supervised the twins' attempts at bread making. The cabin was warm and noisy, and full of the kind of domestic chaos that Elias had come to love, and when the knock came, everyone went still. "Stay here," Elias said, his hand automatically moving to the rifle that was never far from reach. He crossed to the door and opened it to find Miss Prudence Walker standing on his porch for the second time in as many weeks. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was a man Elias didn't recognize, tall, thin, with a pinched face and spectacles that reflected the weak winter sun. "Mr. McCord," Miss Walker said, and her voice had none of the hostility it had carried during her first visit. "May we come in? This is Mr. Harold Finch from the Territorial Orphan Society." Elias's blood went cold. He stepped back to let them enter, his mind racing. The Orphan Society. Of course. He should have expected this. 7 children, no legal guardians, no documentation. It was only a matter of time before someone official came asking questions. Lydia had risen from the table the moment she heard the name, and Elias could see her hands trembling as she smoothed her apron. The children had clustered behind her, instinctively seeking protection, and Thomas had moved to stand at her shoulder like a small, fierce guardian. "Mrs. Rowe," Mr. Finch said, his voice thin and reedy, "I've been sent by the Territorial Authority to assess the situation regarding the children in your care." "They're not in my care," Lydia said, and her voice was steady despite her trembling hands. "They're my children." "That's precisely what I'm here to determine." Finch's eyes swept the room, taking in the 7 children, the modest cabin, the woman with the still healing wound on her shoulder. "I understand that none of these children are biologically yours. Is that correct?" "Biology doesn't make a family, Mr. Finch." "Perhaps not. But the law requires certain documentation, certain procedures." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. "I'll need to speak with each child individually, and I'll need to conduct a thorough inspection of the living conditions here." "These children have been through enough," Lydia said. "They don't need some stranger interrogating them about their pasts." "I'm afraid it's not optional, Mrs. Rowe. The territory has an obligation to ensure the welfare of orphaned children. If proper procedures weren't followed in placing these children in your care—" "Proper procedures?" Lydia's voice rose, and Elias could see the anger building in her like a storm. "Do you want to know what proper procedures did for these children, Mr. Finch? Thomas was left to die in a ditch after his entire family was killed by cholera. Emma's mother bled to death giving birth to her, and the proper procedures were going to send her to a workhouse. Marcus was beaten so badly by his proper guardians that he couldn't walk for a week. And Peter—" Her voice cracked and she had to stop. Little Peter had pressed himself against her legs, his face buried in her skirts, and when she continued, her voice was barely a whisper. "Peter was found wandering alone on the prairie, 3 years old. He couldn't tell us his name, couldn't tell us where he came from, couldn't tell us anything except that he was hungry and scared and alone. These children have been failed by every proper procedure there is, Mr. Finch. The only thing that's kept them alive is love. And I'm not going to apologize for that." The room was silent. Even Miss Walker, who Elias had never seen lost for words, seemed struck dumb by Lydia's outburst. Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles. Be that as it may, nothing." Elias stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had reached the limit of his patience. "These children are staying here. They're not going to any orphan society, they're not going to any workhouse, and they're not going to any proper placement that separates them from the only person who's ever truly cared for them. Mr. McCord, I appreciate your sentiment, but the law almost let Caleb Rowe get away with murder. The law put a bounty on this woman's head for a crime she didn't commit. So you'll forgive me if I don't have much faith in what the law says about what's best for these children." Finch's face had gone red. "This is highly irregular. I'll have to report whatever you want. But until you come back with more than a notebook and a condescending attitude, these children aren't going anywhere." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then, to Elias's surprise, Miss Walker stepped forward. "Mr. Finch," she said, "perhaps I might have a word with you outside?" Finch looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Miss Walker's expression stopped him. He nodded stiffly and followed her out the door, leaving Elias and Lydia and 7 very frightened children in the sudden silence. "What's going to happen?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are they going to take us away?" "No," Elias said firmly. "No one is taking anyone anywhere. But that man said, I don't care what that man said. You're staying here, all of you." You can't promise that, Marcus said, and his voice was bitter with the wisdom of a child who'd been promised things before and seen those promises broken. You can't promise anything. Elias looked at the boy, at all of them, and felt the weight of what he was about to say settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. You're right, he said. I can't promise anything. The world doesn't work that way, and pretending it does would be a lie. But I can tell you this. I will fight for you, every single one of you. I'll fight until there's no fight left in me, and then I'll fight some more. Because you deserve someone who won't give up on you. And from now on, that someone is me. The children stared at him. Lydia stared at him. And in the silence that followed, Elias realized that he meant every word. When Miss Walker returned a few minutes later, she was alone. Mr. Finch has agreed to postpone his assessment, she said, and there was something different in her voice, something almost like respect. I've convinced him that the children are in no immediate danger and that a more thorough investigation can wait until the legal situation with Caleb Rowe is resolved. How did you manage that? Lydia asked. Miss Walker's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. I reminded him that the territory has more pressing concerns than separating children from the people who love them, and I may have mentioned that I have considerable influence with the territorial governor's wife. She paused. It won't hold forever. Eventually, someone will need to address the children's legal status. But for now, you have time. Thank you, Elias said, and meant it. Don't thank me yet. Miss Walker's expression was serious. There's something else. Something I came to tell you before Mr. Finch insisted on tagging along. What is it? Caleb Rowe's lawyers have arrived from Billings. They're pushing for a change of venue, claiming he can't get a fair trial in Reed's Crossing because the sheriff has already made up his mind about his guilt. She hesitated. There's also talk of a countersuit against Lydia. A countersuit? Lydia's face went pale. For what? Kidnapping. The children, I mean. Caleb's claiming that you took them illegally, that they were under his brother's care, and therefore became his responsibility when Samuel died. He's saying you have no legal right to them. That's insane, Elias said. He doesn't want those children. He never wanted them. What he wants and what the law says are two different things, Mr. McCord. And Caleb Rowe has very expensive lawyers who are very good at making the law say whatever he wants it to say. The weight of it settled over the room like a shroud. After everything they'd survived, the running, the hunger, the storm, the confrontation, after all of it, the battle wasn't over. It was just moving to a different battlefield. What do we do? Lydia asked, and for the first time since Elias had known her, she sounded lost. We fight, he said. The same way we've been fighting all along. We find witnesses who saw what really happened. We get the children's stories documented. We build a case that even Caleb's expensive lawyers can't tear apart. And if that's not enough, then we find another way, and another, and another. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I told those children I wouldn't give up on them. I'm not going to give up on you either. Lydia looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude or relief, but something deeper. Something that made his heart beat faster in his chest. Why? She whispered. Why do you keep helping us? You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't ask for a wounded woman and 7 orphans to crash into your life and turn everything upside down. No, Elias agreed. I didn't ask for it, but maybe that's exactly why I needed it. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Thomas came running in, his face flushed with cold and excitement. Mr. McCord, there are riders coming, a lot of them. Elias's hand went to his rifle, his body tensing for another confrontation. How many? I counted 8, but they're not armed. At least I don't think they are. And there's a wagon with them. Lydia and Elias exchanged glances. Stay inside, Elias said. All of you. He stepped out onto the porch just as the riders crested the hill. Thomas had been right. There were 8 of them, plus a wagon being pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses. As they drew closer, Elias recognized some of the faces. They were townspeople from Reed's Crossing, the same people who had stood with Sheriff Brooks against Caleb Rowe 3 weeks ago. Pastor Gideon Hart rode at the front of the group. He was bundled in a heavy coat against the cold, but his white hair was uncovered, and when he reached the cabin, his ancient face broke into a warm smile. Mr. McCord, he called out. We come bearing gifts. Gifts? The town took up a collection. The pastor dismounted with the careful movements of a man well into his 70s. When word got around about the children, about what Mrs. Rowe had done for them, what you'd done to help them, people wanted to contribute. The other riders had begun unloading the wagon, and Elias watched in stunned silence as they carried item after item toward his cabin. Blankets, clothes, food, more food than he'd seen in one place in years, toys for the children, books, medicine, all the things that a family of 9 would need to survive a Montana winter. This is too much, Elias heard himself say. Nonsense! Pastor Hart climbed the porch steps and gripped Elias's shoulder with a strength that belied his age. These children have already been through hell. The least we can do is make sure their future is a little brighter. But I don't understand. After everything, after the gossip, the suspicion, why would people do this? The pastor's eyes were kind. Because people are capable of more than you give them credit for, Mr. McCord. When Miss Walker first came to town talking about a strange woman and a passel of children living in sin on your ranch, there were plenty who were ready to condemn without question. But then we heard the whole story. We heard about Caleb Rowe, about what really happened to Samuel, about these children and everything they'd survived. And we realized that sometimes what looks like scandal is actually just love finding a way to survive in an unforgiving world. Elias didn't know what to say. For 2 years, he'd kept himself apart from the town, nursing his grief and his solitude, convinced that the world had nothing left to offer him. And now here were these people, people he'd barely spoken to, people he'd dismissed as gossips and busybodies, showing up with everything his strange, unexpected family needed. Thank you, he managed finally. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank him. Pastor Hart pointed upward. I'm just the delivery man. By the time the townspeople finished unloading the wagon, the cabin was overflowing with supplies. The children ran from pile to pile, exclaiming over new clothes and toys and books they'd never owned before. Lydia stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers. Pastor Hart stayed for dinner. They squeezed around Elias's table, all 11 of them, and ate venison stew and fresh bread while the pastor told stories about the early days of Reed's Crossing, about the people who had settled this harsh land and the community they'd built against all odds. This territory attracts a certain kind of person, he said, buttering a slice of bread. People who are running from something or toward something. People who've failed everywhere else and figure they might as well try their luck where failure is the norm. But the ones who survive, the ones who make it through the winters and the droughts and the isolation, they learn something important. They learn that no one makes it alone, that we're all carrying wounds, all fighting battles, and the only way to survive is to carry each other. Is that why you testified against Caleb? Lydia asked. Why you broke your silence after all those months? The pastor's face grew somber. I should have spoken up sooner. I knew what he was capable of. I'd seen the way he looked at his brother, with jealousy and resentment and something darker underneath. But I was afraid of what he might do, afraid of the power he wielded. He shook his head slowly. When I saw you in that barn, Mrs. Rowe, saw you ready to die protecting those children, I realized that my fear was a sin, that staying silent while evil flourishes is just another form of complicity. You came when it mattered, Elias said. That's what counts. Perhaps, but I'll carry the weight of those lost months for the rest of my days. The pastor turned to look at the children, who had finished eating and were now exploring the piles of supplies with barely contained excitement. They're beautiful, you know. All children are, but these ones especially. They've seen the worst of humanity, and they're still capable of joy. That's a miracle. It's Lydia, Elias said without thinking. She's the miracle. She kept them alive when anyone else would have given up. Lydia's face flushed. I did what anyone would do. No, you did what most people wouldn't even dream of doing. Don't diminish that. Their eyes met across the table, and the pastor smiled knowingly but said nothing. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the pastor had departed with promises to return, Elias and Lydia sat by the fire as they had so many times before. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the air between them was charged with something unspoken. Can I ask you something? Lydia said finally. Anything. Earlier, when you said you needed this, needed us, what did you mean? Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. He'd been asking himself the same question, and the answer was one he hadn't fully admitted even to himself. When Margaret died, he began slowly, I shut myself off from everything, from the town, from people, from life. I told myself it was grief, and maybe at first it was. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. It became fear. Fear of losing again, fear of caring about someone and having them taken away. It was easier to be alone, to not feel anything, than to risk that kind of pain again. And now? Now I look at you and those children, and I realize that I was already dead. Had been for 2 years. I was breathing and eating and going through the motions, but I wasn't alive. Not really. He turned to face her, and the firelight caught the emotion in his eyes. You brought me back, Lydia. You and those 7 impossible children. You reminded me what it means to care about something, to fight for something, to be alive. Lydia's breath caught. Elias, I know it's too soon. I know there's so much still uncertain, the trial, the children's legal status, all of it, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that whatever happens, whatever comes next, I'm grateful for all of it. Even the gunfire and the blood and the government officials and the terror, I'm grateful because it brought you here. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they hadn't said and everything they were afraid to say. Then Lydia reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I'm grateful too, she whispered. They sat like that until the fire burned low, holding hands in the darkness, 2 wounded people finding their way back to life together. The summons came a week later. Sheriff Brooks rode out personally to deliver it, his face grim as he handed the official document to Elias. Caleb's lawyers got their change of venue, he said. The trial's been moved to Billings, and they've issued subpoenas for Lydia and the children to appear as witnesses. Witnesses for what? For Caleb's countersuit. They're claiming the children were unlawfully taken from their legal guardian, meaning Caleb, as Samuel's only living relative. If they win, the children will be removed from Lydia's care and placed under Caleb's control. Lydia had come to stand beside Elias, and he felt her hand grip his arm with desperate strength. He'll kill them, she whispered. Or worse. He doesn't want them. He just wants to hurt me. If he gets those children, he won't get them. Elias's voice was iron. I don't care what we have to do. He won't get them. The trial's in 3 weeks, Brooks said. You'll need a lawyer, a good one. Caleb's got 3 of the best in the territory, and they're not going to go easy on you. Do you know anyone? There's a man in Billings, Henry Marsh. He's young, but he's sharp. And he's not afraid of taking on the big money. I've sent word to him already. He should be here within the week. Thank you, Sheriff. Brooks nodded, but his expression remained troubled. There's something else, something I didn't want to say in front of the children. What is it? Caleb's offering a settlement. If Lydia drops her testimony against him in the murder case, he'll withdraw his suit for the children. He'll sign over guardianship to her, free and clear. The words hung in the air like poison. You're saying he'll let us keep the children if I let him get away with murder, Lydia said, her voice flat. I'm saying that's what he's offering. And what happens to him? He just walks free? Goes back to his life like nothing happened? Brooks' jaw tightened. Probably. Without your testimony, without the testimony of the children, the case against him is circumstantial at best. A good lawyer could pick it apart. And if I refuse? If I testify? Then he'll do everything in his power to take those children from you. He's got money, influence, and enough spite to make your life a living hell. You need to understand what you're up against. Lydia was silent for a long moment. Elias watched her face, watched the play of emotions across her features. Anger, fear, determination, grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady as stone. Samuel died protecting those children. He died believing they deserved a chance at a real life, not as property to be traded and sold. If I take Caleb's deal, I'm spitting on everything Samuel stood for. I'm letting his killer walk free while I pretend it never happened. She drew herself up, and despite everything, despite the fear that Elias knew must be churning in her gut, She looked like a queen facing down an army. "I won't do it," she said. "Whatever it costs, whatever happens, I won't let Samuel's death mean nothing. Caleb Rowe will face justice, and those children will know that someone, somewhere, cared enough to fight for what's right." Sheriff Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. "Ma'am," he said, "I do believe you're the bravest woman I've ever met." "I'm not brave, I'm just too angry to be scared anymore." After the sheriff left, Elias found Lydia standing at the window, staring out at the frozen landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Take the deal, I mean. No one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me." She turned to face him. What kind of message would that send to those children? That justice can be bought? That the powerful can do whatever they want as long as they're willing to make a deal? They've already learned too many hard lessons about how cruel the world can be. I won't teach them that fighting for what's right is pointless. The trial won't be easy. Caleb's lawyers will try to destroy you. They'll bring up everything, your past, your relationship with Samuel, the way you took the children. They'll make you out to be a kidnapper, a manipulator, a fortune hunter. Let them try. Lydia's chin lifted. I know who I am. I know what I've done and why I did it. And I have something Caleb doesn't have, the truth. The truth doesn't always win in court. Then we'll make it win. She crossed the room and stood before him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I need to know something, Elias. When we go to Billings, when we face Caleb and his lawyers and everyone who wants to see us fail, will you be there? Will you stand with me? You have to ask? I have to know. He reached out and cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, and for a moment the world narrowed down to just the two of them, this woman who had taught him to live again, and this man who had given her a reason to keep fighting. I'll stand with you, he said, through the trial and whatever comes after, through the good times and the bad, through anything and everything this world throws at us. I'll stand with you, Lydia Rowe. Today, tomorrow, for as long as you'll let me. The tears spilled over then, tracking down her cheeks and over his fingers, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I was alone for so long. Even when Samuel was alive, I loved him, I did, but there was always a distance between us, something I couldn't cross. But with you, she shook her head, struggling for words. With you, I feel like I've finally found someone who sees me, really sees me, all of me. The fear and the anger and the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, things might be okay. You see all of it, and you don't look away. Why would I look away? You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She laughed through her tears. I'm a mess, a wounded, exhausted, terrified mess. The most beautiful mess I've ever seen, then. This time, when she laughed, there was joy in it, real joy, untainted by fear or grief or uncertainty. And when Elias leaned down to press his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair and the warmth of her skin, he felt something click into place inside him. This was what he'd been missing. This was what had been absent from his life for 2 long years. Not just love, though there was that too. Hope. Hope for a future that wasn't just survival, but something more, something better, something worth fighting for. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Henry Marsh arrived as promised, a young man in his early 30s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He spent hours interviewing Lydia and the children, documenting their stories, building a case that would stand up against Caleb's army of expensive lawyers. He was thorough, relentless, and utterly confident in a way that made Elias want to believe him when he said they had a fighting chance. The key is the witnesses, Marsh explained one evening, spreading papers across Elias's kitchen table. Pastor Hart, the sheriff, the townspeople who saw Caleb's men attack the ranch. If we can get them to testify, we can establish a pattern of violence and intimidation that undermines Caleb's claim to be a grieving brother seeking justice. Will they testify? Some of them have families, businesses. Caleb's not above retaliation. I've spoken to most of them. They're scared, but they're willing. What happened at your ranch, the way the town came together to stand against Caleb, that changed things. People are tired of living in fear. They want to see him held accountable. And the children? Will they have to testify? Marcia's expression grew somber. Some of them will. Thomas, certainly, he's old enough to give testimony, and he was a direct witness to Samuel's murder. Maybe one or two of the older ones as well. I know it's not ideal, but their stories are crucial. They're the ones who saw what really happened. Lydia had been quiet throughout the conversation, her face pale but determined. I'll prepare them, she said. Thomas especially. He's stronger than he looks, but he's still just a boy. He shouldn't have to carry this burden. None of them should, Marsh agreed. But the burden exists whether they testify or not. At least this way, it might lead to justice. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Billings, Elias found Thomas sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the stars. Can't sleep? Elias asked, settling onto the bench beside him. I keep thinking about what I'm going to say. In court, I mean. About Mr. Samuel. You just tell the truth, son. That's all anyone can ask of you. But what if the truth isn't enough? What if those lawyers twist my words around, make me look like a liar? Thomas's voice cracked. Mr. Samuel was good to me. He and Mrs. Lydia, they were the first people who ever treated me like I was worth something. And now I'm supposed to stand up in front of strangers and talk about watching him die. And I'm supposed to be calm and clear and not mess it up, because if I mess it up, Caleb might win. And then, Thomas. Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Look at me. The boy looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You're not going to mess anything up. You've survived things that would have broken most grown men. You've kept those children together, kept them moving, kept them alive when the whole world was trying to tear you apart. That's not weakness, that's strength. And when you stand up in that courtroom tomorrow, all you have to do is tell the truth. The same truth you've been living with for months. The same truth that brought you here. And if it's not enough, then we'll find another way. But I believe in you, Thomas. I believe the truth will be enough. And I'll be right there in that courtroom every single day, reminding you that you're not alone. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said. Okay, I can do this. I know you can. They sat together in silence after that, watching the stars wheel overhead, two figures on the porch of a cabin that had somehow, impossibly, become a home. Tomorrow they would face Caleb Rowe and his lawyers and everything the law could throw at them. But tonight they had this, the quiet stars, the cold clean air, and the knowledge that whatever came next they would face it together. The journey to Billings took 4 days. They traveled in 2 wagons, one driven by Elias, carrying Lydia and the younger children, and another driven by Thomas, who had insisted he was old enough to handle the responsibility. Henry Marsh rode alongside on horseback, reviewing his notes and muttering to himself about legal precedents and witness testimony. Sheriff Brooks had sent 2 deputies to accompany them, partly for protection and partly as witnesses who could testify to Caleb's attack on the ranch. The weather held, but just barely. The sky remained a flat, steely gray, threatening snow that never quite materialized, and the wind cut through their heaviest coats with a persistence that made Elias's bones ache. The children huddled together under piles of blankets, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, their faces pale with cold and apprehension. Little Emma hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the ranch. She clung to Lydia's hand with a desperate grip, her blue eyes wide and frightened, and nothing anyone said could coax more than a nod or a shake of her head from her. The twins whispered to each other constantly, their private language more active than ever, as if they were building a wall of words between themselves and the terrifying unknown that awaited them. Marcus had retreated into the sullen silence that had characterized him when they'd first arrived, his dark eyes watchful and wary. Matthew kept asking questions that no one could answer. What will the courtroom look like? Will there be a lot of people? Will the judge be scary? Until Thomas finally told him, not unkindly, to save his questions for later. And Peter, the youngest, had developed a cough that worried Lydia and kept her up through the nights, listening to his labored breathing. On the 3rd night, camped beside a frozen creek about 20 miles from Billings, Elias found Lydia sitting alone by the fire after everyone else had gone to sleep. She was staring into the flames with the same expression she'd worn that first morning in his cabin, the expression of someone wrestling with ghosts. "You should rest," he said, settling beside her. "Tomorrow will be hard." "I know, I can't seem to quiet my mind." She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "I keep thinking about what Caleb's lawyers will say, the things they'll accuse me of. They're going to make me out to be a monster, Elias, a kidnapper, a gold digger, a murderess. And the worst part is, some people will believe them. Let them believe what they want. The truth will speak for itself." "Will it?" She turned to face him, and in the firelight he could see the fear she'd been hiding from the children. "I've been telling myself that for months. The truth will come out. Justice will prevail. But Caleb has money and power and connections, and all I have is a story that sounds too terrible to be true. What if the truth isn't enough? What if we lose?" Elias was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. He could have offered empty reassurances, could have told her everything would be fine, that they would certainly win, that there was nothing to worry about. But she deserved better than platitudes. She deserved honesty. "If we lose," he said slowly, "then we appeal. We find new evidence. We keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight with, and then we find something else to fight with. I made you a promise, Lydia. I made those children a promise. And I don't break my promises. Even if it costs you everything, your ranch, your reputation, your future. The ranch is just land. The reputation never mattered much to begin with. And my future..." He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with hers. "My future is sitting right next to me. My future is sleeping in those wagons. Whatever happens in that courtroom, my future is with you and those children. The rest is just details." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling now, a small, fragile thing, but real. "How do you do that?" she whispered. "How do you make everything seem possible?" "I don't know that I do. I just know that some things are worth fighting for, and you're one of them." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the fire burned low, two people finding strength in each other as they faced the battle of their lives. Billings was bigger than Elias had expected. The territorial capital sprawled across the valley floor, a jumble of wooden buildings and muddy streets that seemed to grow more chaotic the deeper they traveled into its heart. There were people everywhere, miners and merchants, cowboys and clerks, women in fine dresses and women in rags, all moving with the frenetic energy of a boomtown drunk on its own success. The noise was overwhelming after the quiet of the ranch, and the children pressed close together in the wagon, their eyes wide as they took in the chaos. Henry Marsh led them to a boarding house on the edge of town, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who took one look at the 7 exhausted children and immediately set about preparing hot food and warm baths without being asked. "Poor lambs," she clucked, ushering them inside. "Look at them, frozen half to death. What kind of monsters drag children across the territory in this weather?" "The kind who don't have a choice," Lydia said quietly. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "The Roe trial, isn't it? I've heard the talk. Half the town's been buzzing about it for weeks." She lowered her voice. "For what it's worth, I don't believe a word that man says. Anyone with eyes can see he's got the devil in him. Let's hope the jury feels the same way." The trial was scheduled to begin the following morning. That night, after the children had been fed and bathed and put to bed, Henry Marsh gathered Elias, Lydia, and Thomas in Mrs. Patterson's sitting room for a final strategy session. "The prosecution will present their case first," Marsh explained, spreading papers across the coffee table. "They'll call witnesses to establish the circumstances of Samuel's death. Pastor Hart, the woman from the trading post, Sheriff Brooks. Then they'll call Lydia and the children to testify about what they saw." "And Caleb's lawyers?" Elias asked. "They'll try to discredit every single witness. They'll question motives, poke holes in timelines, suggest alternative explanations for what happened. And when it's time for the defense to present their case, they'll paint Caleb as a grieving brother who was wrongfully accused by a scheming woman who wanted his family's money." "That's absurd," Lydia said. "I never wanted their money. I never wanted any of this." "I know that. You know that. But the jury doesn't. That's what we have to prove." Marsh leaned forward, his expression intense. Lydia, when you take the stand, you need to be calm, clear. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to provoke you, you cannot lose your temper. These lawyers are experts at making witnesses look unreliable. The moment you get angry, the moment you seem defensive, they'll use it against you. What about Thomas? Elias asked. He's just a boy. They can't possibly expect him to hold up against that kind of pressure. I've prepared him as best I can. He knows what to expect, and he knows how important his testimony is. Marsh turned to the boy, who had been listening in silence. Thomas, I need you to understand something. When you're up there, the only thing that matters is the truth. Don't try to be clever. Don't try to anticipate what they want you to say. Just answer the questions honestly, as simply as you can. Can you do that? Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady when he answered. Yes, sir, I can do that. Good. Marsh began gathering his papers. Get some sleep, all of you. Tomorrow, we start fighting. The Yellowstone County Courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, designed to convey the authority and permanence of law in a territory that was still more wild than civilized. When Elias and Lydia arrived the next morning with the children, a crowd had already gathered on the steps. Curious onlookers, newspaper reporters, and what looked like half the population of Billings, all craning their necks for a glimpse of the notorious Lydia Rowe. Don't look at them, Elias murmured, his hand steady on Lydia's elbow. Keep your eyes forward. Don't give them anything. The inside of the courthouse was only slightly less chaotic. The main courtroom was packed with spectators, every seat filled and people standing 3 deep along the walls. At the front of the room, behind a massive oak desk, sat Judge Harrison Pierce, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the heart of things. And at the defendant's table, surrounded by 3 lawyers in expensive suits, sat Caleb Rowe. He looked different than he had at the ranch. The rough traveling clothes had been replaced by a tailored suit of charcoal gray. His hair was neatly combed, and his face wore an expression of dignified suffering, the look of a man who had been wrongfully accused and was bravely enduring the injustice. When his eyes met Lydia's across the courtroom, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Elias's blood run cold. All rise, the bailiff called out. This court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harrison Pierce presiding. The trial of Caleb Rowe had begun. The first day belonged to the prosecution. District Attorney William Foster was a burly man with a booming voice and a talent for making complex situations seem simple. He laid out the case against Caleb Rowe with the precision of a carpenter building a house, each piece of evidence carefully placed, each witness testimony adding another layer to the structure. Pastor Gideon Hart was the first to take the stand. The old man looked frail under the harsh lights of the courtroom, but his voice was strong as he recounted what he had witnessed on that terrible day 3 months ago. I was traveling to Helena to visit my sister, he said. My route took me past the place where Samuel and Lydia Rowe had made camp with the children. I stopped to offer my blessings and perhaps share a meal. And what did you see when you arrived? Foster asked. I saw Caleb Rowe and his men. They had surrounded the camp. Samuel was trying to protect his wife and the children, but he was outnumbered. I heard Caleb demanding that Samuel hand over the children, said they were his property now, that Samuel had no right to them. And what happened next? Pastor Hart's voice wavered, but he pressed on. Samuel refused. He said the children weren't property, that they were human beings who deserved to be loved, not sold. Caleb laughed, said Samuel had always been too soft for his own good, and then, take your time, Pastor. Then he drew his pistol and shot Samuel in the back. Samuel had turned away, turned to shield his wife, and Caleb shot him, just like that, like he was putting down a dog. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Elias watched Caleb's face for any sign of guilt or shame, but the man's expression remained perfectly composed, a mask of polite interest, as if the pastor were describing something that had happened to someone else entirely. What happened after the shooting? Foster continued. There was chaos. Lydia was screaming. The children were crying. One of Caleb's men fired at Lydia, hit her in the shoulder. I think they meant to kill her too, to eliminate all the witnesses. But some of the other men balked at that. Shooting a man is one thing, but shooting a woman and children... The pastor shook his head. There was an argument. In the confusion, Lydia managed to gather the children and flee. I wanted to help, but I was an old man against armed killers. All I could do was watch. And you didn't report this to the authorities? No. The word came out heavy with shame. God forgive me. I was afraid. Caleb Rowe has money, power, influence. I'd seen what he was capable of. I convinced myself that speaking up would only get me killed and wouldn't bring Samuel back anyway. I convinced myself that silence was the smart choice. His eyes found Lydia's across the courtroom. I was wrong. I was a coward, and I've regretted it every day since. The cross-examination was brutal. Caleb's lead attorney, a silver-tongued man named Prescott, approached the witness stand with the easy confidence of a predator circling wounded prey. Pastor Hart, he began smoothly, you say you witnessed my client shoot his brother. Yet you waited 3 months to come forward with this information. 3 months of silence. Why is that? I told you, I was afraid. Afraid. Yes, you mentioned that. But isn't it also true that you have a history of, let's call it imaginative storytelling? Didn't you once claim to have seen angels descending from heaven during a revival meeting in Bozeman? A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and the pastor's face reddened. That was a religious experience. It has nothing to do with, and isn't it also true that your eyesight has been failing for years? That you've been known to mistake strangers for friends, cattle for horses, and on one memorable occasion, your own barn for the church? My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I know what I saw that day. Do you? Do you really? Prescott leaned in close. Or is it possible that you saw a tragic accident, a confrontation that got out of hand, and your failing eyes and fearful mind transformed it into something more sinister? Isn't it possible that my client was simply defending himself against a brother who had become violent and unstable? No, that's not what happened. But you can't be certain, can you? Not with your eyesight, not with your fear, not with 3 months of silence during which the story could have grown and changed in your memory. I know what I saw. Thank you, Pastor. No further questions. The pastor stepped down from the stand, looking older and more fragile than he had before. Elias caught his eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to testify, regardless of how the cross-examination had gone. But the damage was done. Prescott had planted doubt, and doubt was all Caleb needed. The second day brought more witnesses. The woman from the trading post, Sheriff Brooks, 2 of the townspeople who had stood against Caleb at the ranch. Each told their story, and each was systematically dismantled by Prescott's relentless questioning. By the time the prosecution rested, the case that had seemed so strong was beginning to show cracks. This is bad, Henry Marsh admitted that night, pacing the sitting room of the boarding house. Prescott is good. Better than I expected. He's not trying to prove Caleb's innocence. He's trying to create enough doubt that the jury can't convict. What do we do? Lydia asked. We stick to the plan. Tomorrow, you take the stand. You tell your story, everything that happened, from the moment you met Samuel to the moment you found shelter at Elias's ranch. You make them see you as a person, not as the scheming villain Caleb's lawyers have been painting. And then, he hesitated. And then what? And then Thomas testifies. He's our strongest witness, a child who saw everything, who has no reason to lie. If anyone can convince that jury of what really happened, it's him. He's just a boy, Elias said. Prescott will tear him apart. Maybe. Or maybe Thomas will surprise us all. Marsh stopped pacing and turned to face them. I've seen a lot of trials, and I've learned that you can never predict what will move a jury. Sometimes the most carefully constructed argument falls flat, and sometimes a single moment of genuine truth changes everything. We have the truth on our side. Now we have to trust that it's enough. The morning of the third day dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the boarding house and seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. Lydia dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible, and spent long minutes in front of the mirror, trying to make herself look respectable without looking like she was trying too hard. You're beautiful, Elias said from the doorway. She turned, her face pale with nerves. I look like a woman who hasn't slept in days. You look like a woman who's about to fight for everything she loves. There's nothing more beautiful than that. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was Thomas, already dressed and ready, his young face set with determination. "It's time," he said. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been the previous days. Word had spread that Lydia Rowe herself would be testifying, and it seemed like half of Billings had turned out to watch. Elias found seats for the younger children near the back, where Mrs. Patterson had agreed to watch over them, and then made his way to the front row, directly behind the prosecution's table. He wanted Lydia to be able to see him when she looked up. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. The prosecution calls Lydia Rowe to the stand. The walk from her seat to the witness stand felt like miles. Lydia could feel every eye in the room on her, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. "Is that her? She doesn't look like a murderess. I heard she killed him for his money. I heard she seduced him away from his family, and it took every ounce of willpower she possessed to keep her head high and her steps steady." The bailiff held out a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" "I do." "Please state your name for the record." "Lydia Ann Rowe." District Attorney Foster rose from his seat, his expression kind and encouraging. "Mrs. Rowe, I know this is difficult. Please take your time and tell us, in your own words, how you came to be fleeing across Montana with 7 children and a bullet wound in your shoulder." Lydia took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She told them about meeting Samuel at a church social in Virginia, how he had been kind and gentle, so different from the other young men who saw women as property to be acquired rather than people to be loved. She told them about their wedding, about their dreams of starting a family, about the heartbreak of realizing that children might never come. "Samuel couldn't accept it," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "He believed that family was about love, not blood. That's why when we started finding the orphans, children who had been abandoned, abused, left to die, he insisted we take them in, every single one." "How many children did you take in?" 7, eventually. Thomas was the first. We found him by the side of the road, half dead from cholera. His entire family had been killed. He was 10 years old. "And the others?" "Emma's mother died in childbirth. Marcus was being beaten by the family that was supposed to be caring for him. The twins were about to be sold to a mining company as labor. Matthew's father abandoned him when his mother died. And Peter," her voice cracked. "Peter was wandering alone on the prairie, 3 years old. No one ever came looking for him. No one ever cared. So you and your husband took them all in." "We did." Samuel's family, his brother Caleb especially, was furious. They said we were wasting the family fortune on worthless orphans. They said we were bringing shame on the Rowe name. But Samuel didn't care. He said the only shame was leaving children to suffer when you had the power to help them. "And what happened when Samuel's father died? When the family estate passed to Samuel?" Lydia's expression hardened. "Caleb couldn't accept it. He'd always been jealous of Samuel, the favorite son, the one everyone loved. When Samuel inherited everything, Caleb demanded that we hand over the children. He said they were a burden, a waste of resources. He had plans for them, he said, plans that would turn them into assets rather than liabilities." "What kind of plans?" "He wanted to sell them, to mines, to factories, to anyone who would pay for child labor. When Samuel refused, Caleb swore he would take everything from us. The estate, the money, the children. He said if he couldn't have them, no one would." "And did he act on those threats?" "We fled before he could. Samuel knew his brother, knew what he was capable of. We took the children and headed west, hoping to start over somewhere Caleb couldn't find us." The tears were falling freely now, but Lydia made no move to wipe them away. "We were wrong. He found us. He always found us." "Tell us what happened on the day Samuel died." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notebooks, transfixed by the raw emotion in Lydia's voice. "We had stopped to rest. The children were exhausted, and we needed supplies. We thought we were safe. We hadn't seen any sign of Caleb's men in days. But they were waiting for us." She paused, gathering herself. "Caleb rode into our camp with 6 armed men. He told Samuel to hand over the children. Samuel refused. He said the children weren't property, that they had a right to choose their own lives." Caleb laughed. He said Samuel had always been too soft, too weak. And then he said something I'll never forget. What did he say? He said, "If you won't give them to me, brother, then you're no use to anyone." And then he shot him. Samuel wasn't even armed. He had turned to shield me, and Caleb shot him in the back like a coward. A gasp went through the courtroom. Elias watched Caleb's face, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, he saw something flash in the man's eyes. Not guilt, not shame, rage. The rage of a predator whose prey was fighting back. "What happened next?" Foster asked gently. "One of Caleb's men shot me. The bullet hit my shoulder. I think they meant to kill us all, me and the children, everyone who had witnessed what Caleb did. But some of the men balked. They hadn't signed on to murder women and children. In the confusion, I managed to gather the children and run. We fled into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on our backs." "And you eventually made your way to Elias McCord's ranch." "Yes. I don't know how many days we walked. 4, 5, maybe more. I was feverish from the wound, and the children were starving. When we found Mr. McCord's barn, I thought we were going to die there. I was ready to die, as long as I could protect the children until my last breath." Her eyes found Elias in the crowd. "But Mr. McCord found us. He could have turned us away, should have turned us away. Instead, he saved our lives. He saved all of our lives." Foster nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Rowe. No further questions." The courtroom seemed to let out a collective breath, but Lydia knew the worst was yet to come. She watched Prescott rise from his seat, straightening his expensive suit, and felt her stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Rowe," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "That was quite a moving story. I'm sure everyone in this courtroom was touched by your account of rescuing orphans and fleeing from the wicked Caleb Rowe. But I wonder if you'd be willing to answer a few questions that might complicate that narrative." "I'll answer any questions you have." "How generous." "Let's start with something simple. When you married Samuel Rowe, were you aware of his family's wealth?" "I knew they were comfortable, yes." "Comfortable. That's an interesting way to describe one of the richest families in Virginia." Prescott began to pace, his movements slow and deliberate. "In fact, isn't it true that the Rowe estate was worth over $100,000? That Samuel stood to inherit everything?" "I didn't marry Samuel for his money." "Of course not. But you certainly benefited from it, didn't you? The fine clothes, the servants, the ability to take in 7 orphans without a thought for the cost." "Samuel and I both believed, and isn't it also true that when Samuel's father died, you encouraged him to cut ties with his brother, to write Caleb out of the will entirely?" "Caleb wanted to hurt those children. Samuel was protecting them." "Protecting them? Or isolating his brother from the family fortune?" Prescott stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. "Isn't it possible, Mrs. Rowe, that you saw an opportunity when you married Samuel? An opportunity to gain access to his wealth, to turn him against his own family, and eventually, when he was no longer useful, to dispose of him entirely? That's not true, isn't it? You admit that you and your husband were in conflict with Caleb Rowe. You admit that you fled with the children and the family's money. And you claim that Caleb murdered Samuel. But isn't it convenient that the only witnesses to this alleged murder are yourself and 7 children who have every reason to tell whatever story you've taught them?" "I haven't taught them anything. They saw what happened." "Did they? Or did they see what you wanted them to see?" Prescott's voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Let me paint a different picture for the jury, Mrs. Rowe. Let me suggest that you and your husband had a falling out, perhaps over money, perhaps over the children, perhaps over something else entirely. Let me suggest that in a moment of anger, you shot your husband and then fled, taking the children as shields and telling anyone who would listen that Caleb Rowe was to blame." "That's a lie." "Is it? Then explain to me why you ran. If Caleb murdered your husband in cold blood, why not go to the authorities? Why not report the crime and trust the law to deliver justice? Because the law believed Caleb, because he had money and influence, and he'd already put a bounty on my head for a murder I didn't commit? Or because you knew that any investigation would reveal the truth, that you, not Caleb, were responsible for Samuel's death?" Lydia was shaking now, her composure finally cracking under the relentless assault. "I loved my husband. I would never—" No further questions. The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia sat frozen in the witness stand, tears streaming down her face, her hands gripping the wooden rail so tightly her knuckles had gone white. In the gallery, Elias was half out of his seat, restrained only by Henry Marsh's hand on his arm. "The witness may step down," Judge Pierce said, his expression unreadable. Lydia walked back to her seat on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. As she passed Caleb's table, she heard him whisper, so quiet that only she could hear, "I told you I would destroy you." She didn't respond. She couldn't. All she could do was keep walking, keep breathing, keep hoping that somehow, impossibly, the truth would still be enough. The afternoon session began with Thomas. He looked impossibly young as he walked to the witness stand, a 13-year-old boy in clothes that didn't quite fit, his dark hair combed back from a face that was too thin and too serious for someone his age. But his eyes were steady as he placed his hand on the Bible, and his voice didn't waver as he swore to tell the truth. "Thomas," Foster began gently, "I know this is difficult. Can you tell us, in your own words, what you remember about the day Samuel Rowe died?" The boy was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on something far away. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "We had been traveling for weeks. Mrs. Rowe, I mean. She always said we were going somewhere safe, somewhere Caleb couldn't find us. But I could tell she was scared. Mr. Samuel was scared too, even though he tried not to show it. And what happened when Caleb Rowe arrived? We heard horses first. A lot of them. Mr. Samuel told us all to stay behind him, me and the other children. He told Mrs. Lydia to be ready to run if things went bad." Thomas paused, his jaw tightening. Caleb rode into camp like he owned the place. He had men with him, 6 of them, all armed. He told Mr. Samuel to hand over the children, said we belonged to him now. What did Samuel say? He said no. He said we weren't property, that we had the right to choose our own lives. Caleb laughed. He called Mr. Samuel weak, soft. He said, Thomas's voice wavered for the first time. He said if Mr. Samuel couldn't be useful, there was no point keeping him around. And then? Mr. Samuel turned to make sure Mrs. Lydia was behind him. He was trying to protect her, and that's when Caleb shot him. In the back. Mr. Samuel didn't even have a gun. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Prescott, who had been so confident during Lydia's cross-examination, seemed momentarily taken aback by the raw honesty in the boy's voice. What happened after the shooting? Foster asked. Everything went crazy. Mrs. Lydia screamed. One of Caleb's men shot at her, hit her in the shoulder. There was a lot of yelling. Some of Caleb's men didn't want to kill women and children, and they started arguing. Mrs. Lydia grabbed my hand and told me to get the others. So I did. I got everyone together and we ran. You ran? Yes, sir. We ran for a long time, days maybe. Mrs. Lydia was hurt bad, but she wouldn't stop. She said we had to keep moving, that Caleb would be coming. She was right. He's been coming for us ever since. Foster nodded slowly. Thank you, Thomas. No further questions. Prescott rose, his expression carefully neutral, but Elias could see something behind that mask. Uncertainty, perhaps. Wariness. Even a man like Prescott knew there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and attacking a child witness was dangerously close to one of them. Thomas, he began, his voice noticeably softer than it had been with Lydia. You've been through a lot. Everyone in this courtroom can see that. But I need to ask you some questions that might be difficult. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. Now you say you saw my client shoot Samuel Rowe, but you also admit that things were chaotic, people yelling, horses moving, dust everywhere. Isn't it possible that in all that confusion, you might have been mistaken about what you saw? No, sir. No? You sound very certain. I am certain. Thomas's voice was steady, his eyes meeting Prescott's without flinching. I was standing right behind Mr. Samuel. I saw everything. Mr. Caleb raised his gun and pointed it at Mr. Samuel's back. He pulled the trigger. I saw the bullet hit. I saw Mr. Samuel fall. But you were frightened, weren't you? And frightened children sometimes see things that aren't really there. I was frightened, Thomas agreed. But I wasn't imagining things. I know what I saw. and what I saw was murder. Prescott's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. You've been living with Mrs. Rowe for months now, first on the road, then at the McCord Ranch. Isn't it possible that she's influenced your memories, that she's told you what to say? Mrs. Lydia never told me what to say. She didn't have to. I was there. I saw what happened. And yet your story matches hers perfectly. Doesn't that seem convenient? Thomas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for a 13-year-old boy. My whole family died of cholera, he said slowly. My ma and pa. My little sister. I watched them all die one by one, and there was nothing I could do. After that, I was alone. Nobody wanted me. Nobody cared if I lived or died. And then Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Lydia found me. They took me in. They treated me like I was worth something. Mr. Samuel used to say that family isn't about blood, it's about love. He died protecting that belief. And I'm not going to let his killer get away with it just because some lawyer thinks I can be confused or manipulated. The courtroom was utterly silent. Prescott opened his mouth, closed it again, and for a long moment simply stood there, seemingly at a loss. No further questions, he said finally. Thomas stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to his seat. As he passed Lydia, she reached out and squeezed his hand, just for a moment, just enough to let him know that he had done well, that she was proud of him, that he was everything Samuel had believed he could be. The day's testimony continued with more witnesses, more questions, more legal maneuvering. But something had shifted in the courtroom. The doubt that Prescott had so carefully cultivated was beginning to crack, replaced by something that felt almost like conviction. That night, back at the boarding house, Henry Marsh was cautiously optimistic. Thomas was incredible, he said. Prescott couldn't touch him, and the jury saw it. You could tell by their faces. They believe him. Is it enough? Lydia asked. I don't know. Caleb's lawyers still have tricks up their sleeves, but for the first time since this trial started, I actually think we have a chance. Outside, the wind had died down, and the sky had cleared to reveal a brilliant canopy of stars. Elias stood on the porch of the boarding house, looking up at them, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. Lydia came out to join him, wrapping her coat tightly around her shoulders. You should be resting, he said. So should you. They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars, breathing in the cold, clean air. Whatever happens tomorrow, Lydia said finally, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done, for everything you've been. Lydia, let me finish. When I walked into your barn that night, I was ready to die. I'd given up hope, not just for myself, but for those children. I thought the world was too cruel, too broken, too unfair for any of us to survive. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that there's still kindness in this world, still courage, still people who will stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything. I didn't do anything special. I just did what anyone would do. No. She turned to face him, and in the starlight, her eyes were bright with tears. You did what almost no one would do. You opened your home to strangers. You stood up against a powerful enemy. You believed in me when you had no reason to. That's not ordinary, Elias. That's extraordinary, and I will never, ever forget it. He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, we face it together. All of us. As a family. As a family, she repeated, and standing there under the stars, holding hands in the darkness, they both dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The final day of testimony brought a surprise that no one had anticipated. It happened during Caleb's own testimony. He had taken the stand to present his version of events, a carefully rehearsed performance of grief and bewilderment, painting himself as a loving brother who had been wrongfully accused by a scheming woman. He was good, Elias had to admit. Every word, every gesture, every expression was perfectly calibrated to evoke sympathy. And then the doors of the courtroom burst open. Everyone turned to look. A woman was walking down the center aisle, middle-aged, plainly dressed, her face set with determination. Behind her came two men that Elias recognized with a shock. They were Caleb's men, the same men who had attacked the ranch. The same men who had followed Caleb's orders without question. But now they were walking into the courtroom with their hands empty and their heads bowed. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Pierce demanded. The woman stepped forward. "Your Honor, my name is Martha Simmons. I was Caleb Rowe's housekeeper for 15 years, and I have evidence that will prove beyond any doubt that this man murdered his brother." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Prescott was on his feet, objecting strenuously. Caleb's face had gone pale, his composure finally cracking. The spectators were shouting, the reporters were scribbling furiously, and through it all, Judge Pierce was banging his gavel and demanding order. When the noise finally subsided, the judge turned to the woman with a stern expression. "This is highly irregular, Mrs. Simmons. The defense has rested. The prosecution has rested. You cannot simply walk in here and, with respect, Your Honor, I have a signed confession from 2 of Caleb Rowe's own men, corroborating everything Mrs. Rowe has testified to. And I have letters, written in Caleb's own hand, detailing his plans to murder his brother and take control of the family estate." "That's impossible." Caleb was on his feet now, his voice high and desperate. "This woman is lying. Those men are liars. This is a conspiracy to— Sit down, Mr. Rowe." Judge Pierce's voice was ice. He turned to Martha Simmons. "Approach the bench. Bring your evidence." The next hour was a blur of legal arguments and dramatic revelations. Martha Simmons testified that she had discovered Caleb's letters years ago and had kept them hidden, too afraid to come forward. The 2 men, former members of Caleb's hired gang, had apparently had a crisis of conscience and had sought her out, confessing their role in Samuel's murder and agreeing to testify. The letters were damning. In his own handwriting, Caleb had detailed his hatred for his brother, his plans to eliminate Samuel and take control of the family fortune, and his intention to deal with the orphans in whatever way proved most profitable. When the evidence had been presented and the testimony concluded, Judge Pierce called for a recess to allow the jury to deliberate. "This changes everything," Henry Marsh said, his voice shaking with barely contained excitement. "Those letters, those confessions, there's no way the jury can ignore this. Caleb is finished." But Caleb Rowe wasn't finished yet. During the recess, while everyone was milling around the courthouse steps, one of Caleb's remaining men made a desperate play. He had smuggled a pistol into the courthouse, and as Lydia and Elias emerged into the afternoon sunlight, he raised the weapon and took aim. "Look out!" The shout came from Thomas, who had seen the gunman a split second before anyone else. He threw himself at Lydia, knocking her to the ground just as the shot rang out. The bullet went wide, striking the brick wall of the courthouse, and sending up a spray of dust and debris. And then Sheriff Brooks was there, and 2 of his deputies, and the gunman was on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back, and people were screaming and running, and the chaos seemed like it would never end. When the dust settled, Lydia was unhurt. Thomas was unhurt. But Caleb Rowe was being dragged back into the courthouse in chains, his mask of dignified composure finally shattered, his face contorted with rage. "You can't do this to me," he was screaming. "I am Caleb Rowe. You are under arrest for attempted murder," Sheriff Brooks said calmly. Among other things, the jury returned their verdict 2 hours later. Judge Pierce read it aloud, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom with the weight of finality. On the charge of murder in the 1st degree, the jury finds the defendant, Caleb Rowe, guilty. The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, and then the courtroom exploded. People were cheering, crying, embracing each other. Lydia collapsed against Elias, sobbing with relief. The children clustered around them, their faces bright with joy and disbelief. It was over. After months of running, months of fear, months of wondering if the truth would ever be enough, it was finally over. Judge Pierce banged his gavel until the noise subsided. "The defendant is remanded to custody pending sentencing. This court is adjourned." As the bailiffs led Caleb away, he turned to look at Lydia one last time. His face was blank now, empty of everything, rage, desperation, even hatred. He looked like a man who had already begun to disappear. "You haven't won," he said. "You'll never be free of me." Lydia met his gaze without flinching. "I already am." And then he was gone, and the nightmare that had haunted her for so long was finally, truly over. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elias stood with Lydia and the children, surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, and townspeople who wanted to shake their hands and tell them how brave they were. But through all the noise and chaos, Elias was aware of only one thing: the woman standing beside him, her hand in his, her face turned toward the sunset. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we go home," he said. "All of us. Together." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw everything he'd been searching for without knowing it: hope, love, the promise of a future that was worth fighting for. "Home," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." And as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elias McCord finally understood what he'd known in his heart from the moment he'd found a bleeding woman and 7 children in his barn. This was where he was meant to be. This was who he was meant to love. This was the family he'd been waiting for all along. The verdict was not the end. Elias had hoped it would be, had allowed himself to imagine that the moment the jury foreman spoke that single, powerful word, guilty, all the darkness that had haunted them would simply dissolve like morning mist under the Montana sun. But the law moved slowly, and Caleb Rowe's lawyers were not ready to surrender their client without exhausting every possible avenue of appeal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the verdict. 3 weeks of waiting, of uncertainty, of looking over their shoulders even though the monster was behind bars. 3 weeks during which Caleb's remaining allies worked tirelessly to undermine the conviction, filing motions and appeals and procedural challenges that seemed designed more to delay than to succeed. They stayed in Billings during those weeks. Henry Marsh had advised against returning to the ranch until everything was truly settled, and Mrs. Patterson had graciously extended their stay at her boarding house, refusing to accept any additional payment despite Elias's protests. "You've been through enough," she told him firmly. "The least I can do is provide a roof over your heads while those vultures in their fancy suits try to find a way to set that devil free." The children adapted to their temporary home with the resilience that continued to amaze Elias. Thomas had taken to helping Mrs. Patterson with chores around the boarding house, his natural competence making him invaluable within days. The twins had discovered a passion for cooking and spent hours in the kitchen, learning recipes that Mrs. Patterson had inherited from her grandmother. Marcus was devouring every book he could get his hands on, his quick mind hungry for knowledge after years of deprivation. Matthew practiced his letters and numbers with an intensity that suggested he understood, even at his young age, that education was a key to a future he'd never dared to imagine. Emma followed Lydia everywhere, her small hand always reaching for Lydia's, her blue eyes bright with a trust that was slowly replacing the fear that had lived there for so long. And little Peter, though still plagued by nightmares and unable to speak of whatever horrors lay in his past, had begun to laugh again, a sound so pure and unexpected that it brought tears to Lydia's eyes the first time she heard it. But for all the progress, for all the moments of joy and hope, the shadow of the upcoming sentencing hearing hung over them like a storm cloud that refused to break. "What if they overturn the verdict?" Lydia asked one night after the children had gone to bed. She and Elias were sitting in the boarding house parlor, the fire crackling in the hearth, the winter wind howling outside. "What if Caleb's lawyers find some technicality, some loophole? What if he goes free?" "He won't go free. You can't know that. I know that 12 people heard the evidence and decided he was guilty of murder. I know that Judge Pierce isn't the kind of man who can be bought or intimidated. And I know that even if something goes wrong with the sentencing, Caleb still tried to have you killed in broad daylight in front of 100 witnesses. There's no walking away from that." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "I keep dreaming about him," she admitted. "About Samuel. Sometimes he's alive, and we're back in Virginia, and everything is the way it was before. But then I wake up and remember that he's gone, that I'll never see him again, and it feels like losing him all over." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He understood grief, understood it intimately, but he also knew that there were no words that could truly comfort someone in the depths of it. So instead of speaking, he simply reached out and took her hand, holding it gently in his own. "I loved him," Lydia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Not the way I've come to feel about you. But I loved him. He was kind and good, and he believed in things that most people have forgotten how to believe in. He deserved better than what he got. He got you, Elias said quietly. He got those children. He got a wife who was willing to fight for everything he believed in, even after he was gone. I think he would have said that was more than enough. Lydia turned to look at him, and in the firelight, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. How do you do that? How do you always know exactly what to say? I don't. Most of the time I'm just stumbling along, hoping I don't make things worse. You never make things worse. You only ever make them better. Before he could respond, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. A kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of questions she wasn't ready to ask out loud. Elias's heart stuttered in his chest, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe, forgot everything except the warmth of her mouth against his and the feeling that something momentous was happening, something that would change the course of both their lives. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were uncertain. "I'm sorry," she started. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize." His voice was rough with emotion. "Don't ever apologize for that. I needed you to know. Before the hearing, before whatever happens next. I needed you to know that you're not just a friend or a protector or a place of refuge. You're everything, Elias. You're everything I never knew I was looking for." He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "When this is over," he said, "when Caleb has faced whatever justice awaits him and the children are safe and the law has nothing more to say about any of it, I'm going to ask you something important, and I hope with everything in me that you'll say yes." Lydia's breath caught. "Elias? Not now, not tonight, but soon." He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in. Soon. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, two wounded souls finding their way towards something that felt almost like healing. The morning of the sentencing hearing dawned clear and cold. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind of Montana sky that seemed to stretch on forever, mocking the petty concerns of the humans who lived beneath it. Elias dressed in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and helped the children into their own formal clothes. They were all going to the courthouse today. All of them. Marsh had thought it important for the judge to see the family that Caleb had tried to destroy. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they walked through the streets of Billings toward the courthouse. "A little," Elias admitted. "Are you?" "I keep thinking about what you said, about how the truth will be enough." The boy was quiet for a moment. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe that we've done everything we can. I believe that good people have stood up against evil, and I believe that whatever happens today, we'll face it together." Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's not nothing, Thomas. That's not nothing at all." The courthouse was less crowded than it had been during the trial. Most of the curious onlookers had lost interest once the verdict was delivered, and now only the true stakeholders remained. Lydia and Elias and the children, Henry Marsh and his assistants, Sheriff Brooks and his deputies, and a handful of reporters who sensed that today's hearing might provide material for one final story. And at the defendant's table, flanked by armed guards, sat Caleb Rowe. He looked different than he had during the trial. The expensive suit had been replaced by prison grays, and his carefully groomed appearance had given way to a gauntness that spoke of sleepless nights and dwindling hope. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, hadn't changed at all. When his gaze found Lydia's across the courtroom, the hatred in them was as raw and undiluted as ever. "All rise." Judge Pierce entered and took his seat behind the bench. He looked tired, Elias thought, tired and old and burdened by the weight of the decision he was about to render. "This court is now in session for the sentencing of Caleb Jonathan Rowe, convicted of murder in the first degree and an attempted murder." The judge's voice was heavy with formality. "Before I pronounce sentence, the defendant has the right to make a statement. Mr. Rowe, do you wish to address the court?" For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. His chains clinked in the silence. "Your Honor," he began, and his voice was different too, softer, more measured, stripped of the arrogance that had characterized him throughout the trial. I want the court to know that I accept responsibility for my actions. I was angry, and I was jealous, and I let those feelings drive me to do something unforgivable. My brother Samuel was a good man. He deserved better than what I gave him. And Lydia, his eyes flickered to her, and for just an instant, something human seemed to flicker behind the mask. Lydia was a good wife to him. I see that now. I see a lot of things now that I couldn't see before. The courtroom was utterly silent. Elias watched Lydia's face, saw the conflict there, the desire to believe that some part of Caleb might genuinely regret what he'd done, warring with the knowledge of everything he'd put her through. I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I've caused, Caleb continued. I know that the children will carry the scars of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. And I know that asking for mercy is probably more than I deserve, but I'm asking anyway. Not for my sake, but for the sake of whatever good might still be possible in this world. I don't want to die with hatred being the last thing I offer. I want to die, if I must die, knowing that I tried, at the end, to be something better than what I was. He sat down. The silence stretched on. Judge Pierce studied the man before him with an expression that was impossible to read. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. The court has received statements from several character witnesses, as well as victim impact statements from Mrs. Lydia Rowe and her adopted children. We have also received petitions from citizens of Reed's Crossing and Billings, requesting that the maximum sentence be imposed. He paused, shuffling papers on his desk. Mrs. Rowe, do you wish to address the court before sentencing? Lydia rose to her feet. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Your Honor, I want to begin by thanking this court and this community for believing us, for listening to our story and deciding that the truth mattered more than money or power or influence. I know that's not always the case. I know there are people in this world who never get justice, no matter how hard they fight for it. So I don't take this verdict for granted. Not for a second. She paused, gathering herself. When Caleb killed my husband, he took something from me that can never be replaced. Samuel was my partner, my best friend, my companion in the work of building a family out of children that no one else wanted. He believed that every human being has value, that orphans and outcasts and the forgotten ones of this world deserve love and protection just as much as anyone else. He died for that belief. And I have to live with knowing that his last moments were filled with fear and pain, that he was shot in the back by his own brother while trying to protect the people he loved. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't stop. I don't know if Caleb's apology is genuine. I don't know if he's truly changed, or if this is just another manipulation designed to save his own skin. What I know is that 7 children saw their father figure murdered in front of them. What I know is that a bullet in my shoulder was meant to silence me forever. What I know is that Caleb Rowe, despite everything that's happened, still has people in this world who would do his bidding if he were ever set free. She turned to face Caleb directly. You asked for mercy, but you showed no mercy to Samuel. You showed no mercy to those children. You showed no mercy to me. And so I asked this court to show you exactly as much mercy as you showed us. No more, no less. She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped writing, transfixed by the raw emotion in Lydia's words. Judge Pierce cleared his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Rowe. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the court? To Elias's surprise, Thomas stood up. Your Honor, my name is Thomas Wheeler. I'm one of the children that Mrs. Rowe and Mr. Samuel took in. I was there when Caleb Rowe killed Mr. Samuel. I watched it happen. The boy's voice was quiet but unwavering. I don't know much about the law or about what's supposed to happen to people who do what Caleb did, but I know that Mr. Samuel believed everyone deserves a chance to be better. He believed that even people who've made terrible mistakes can change if they're given the opportunity. He paused, and when he continued, there was something ancient in his young voice, the wisdom of a child who had seen too much suffering to believe in simple answers. I don't know if Caleb can change. I don't know if anyone can, really, but I know that Mr. Samuel would want me to hope. He'd want me to believe that there's good in people, even when they've done horrible things. So whatever you decide, Your Honor, I hope you decide it because it's right, not because it's easy or because it makes people feel better, but because it's the right thing to do. He sat down. Lydia put her arm around him, and he leaned into her embrace like a much younger child. Judge Pierce was quiet for a long time. His eyes moved from Caleb to Lydia to Thomas to the other children, taking in the scene before him, a family forged in trauma, holding each other up in the face of whatever was to come. "This case," he said finally, "has been one of the most difficult of my career. Not because the facts were unclear. They were not. Not because the law was ambiguous. It was not. But because it has forced me to reckon with questions that have no easy answers, questions about justice and mercy, questions about what we owe to the victims of terrible crimes, and what we owe to ourselves as a society that aspires to be better than the darkness it confronts." He turned to face Caleb directly. "Mr. Rowe, you stand convicted of murder in the first degree. You shot your own brother in the back, in cold blood, in front of children who had already suffered more than any child should ever have to suffer. You then attempted to frame your brother's widow for the crime, putting a bounty on her head that endangered not only her life but the lives of the 7 innocent children in her care. And when that failed, you attempted to have her killed in broad daylight, in front of this very courthouse." The judge's voice hardened. "I have listened to your statement. I have considered the possibility that you are genuinely remorseful for what you have done, but I cannot escape the conclusion that your words today are simply another attempt at manipulation, another mask worn by a man who has never shown genuine concern for anyone but himself." He drew a deep breath. "The sentence of this court is death by hanging, to be carried out no later than 30 days from this date. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel fell. The sound seemed to echo through the courtroom, through the building, through the cold Montana air outside. Caleb Rowe sat frozen, his face blank with shock, as if he had truly believed that his performance of contrition would save him. The guards moved forward to take him away, and as they did, something broke loose in him. "This isn't over!" he screamed, struggling against his chains. "You hear me, Lydia? This isn't over. I have friends. I have people who will finish what I started. You'll never be safe. Never!" His voice echoed through the courthouse as they dragged him away, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the slamming of heavy doors. And then he was gone. The days that followed were strange and surreal. The execution was scheduled for the end of the month, and there was nothing to do but wait. Wait, and try to adjust to the idea that the nightmare was finally, truly ending. Elias wanted to take Lydia and the children home, back to the ranch where they could begin rebuilding their lives. But Marsh had cautioned them to remain in Billings until Caleb was actually dead. "He still has allies," the lawyer warned. "People who owe him favors, people who might try something desperate. Until the sentence is carried out, you need to stay where there are witnesses, where there's protection." So they stayed, and they waited, and they tried to live their lives as normally as possible while death hung in the air like the promise of a storm. Lydia threw herself into caring for the children. She established routines: breakfast at 7, lessons at 8, outdoor play when the weather allowed, quiet reading time in the afternoons. She cooked meals that reminded her of Virginia, teaching the twins the recipes her grandmother had taught her. She told stories at bedtime, stories about brave knights and clever princesses and ordinary people who did extraordinary things. She held Emma when the nightmares came and sat with Peter during his long silences and listened patiently when Matthew asked his endless questions. And at night, after the children were asleep, she would sit with Elias in the parlor and talk about the past, about the future, about the 1,000 small decisions that make up a life. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him one evening, about a week before the scheduled execution, "about asking me something when this was over." Elias's heart stuttered. "And?" "And I've been thinking that maybe I don't need to wait for you to ask." She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that took his breath away. Not just hope, not just affection, but a certainty that he had never expected to see. "Elias McCord," she said, "I have known you for 3 months. In that time you have saved my life, protected my children, stood against a murderer, and shown me that it's possible to find love again after loss. You have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to believe that the future can be better than the past." "Lydia, let me finish." She reached out and took his hands in hers. "I don't know what the rest of my life holds. I don't know if we'll face more trials, more dangers, more heartbreak. But I know that whatever comes, I want to face it with you. I want to build a home with you. I want to raise those children with you. I want to grow old with you, Elias. I want to be your wife." The words hung in the air between them. Elias felt tears prick at his eyes, something that hadn't happened since Margaret's funeral, something he'd thought he'd forgotten how to do. "You're supposed to let me ask," he said, his voice rough. "I got tired of waiting. I was going to get down on one knee. I was going to make a speech." "You can still make the speech. Just do it as my future husband instead of my hopeful suitor." He laughed then, a real laugh, full and warm, and pulled her into his arms. "Yes," he said against her hair. "Yes, Lydia Rowe. I will be your husband. I will be father to your children. I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift you've just given me." "You already deserve it," she whispered. "You've always deserved it." They held each other for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, both of their faces were wet with tears. "We should tell the children," Lydia said. "In the morning. Tonight is for us." They sat together by the fire, holding hands, talking about the future, about the ranch, about the children, about the life they would build together. For the first time in months, Lydia allowed herself to imagine beyond the next crisis, beyond the next threat. She allowed herself to dream. The news reached them 3 days before the scheduled execution. Elias was helping Thomas with his arithmetic when Sheriff Brooks arrived at the boarding house, his face grim. "There's been a development," he said without preamble. "Caleb Rowe was found dead in his cell this morning." Lydia, who had been in the kitchen with the twins, came running at the sound of the sheriff's voice. "What? How?" "Poison, most likely. We found a vial hidden in his mattress, something he must have smuggled in before the trial. The doctor says he died sometime in the night." "He killed himself?" "That's what it looks like. Left a note, too." Brooks pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Addressed to you, Mrs. Rowe. We've already read it. Had to, for the investigation. But I figured you'd want to see it for yourself." Lydia took the paper with trembling hands. Elias moved to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places, but the words were clear enough. "Lydia, if you're reading this, I've taken myself out of this world before the hangman could do it for me. I suppose that's one final act of control in a life that was always about control. I want you to know that I meant what I said at the sentencing. Not all of it. I'm not fool enough to believe I've suddenly become a good person, but some of it. I did envy Samuel. I envied him his goodness, his ability to love without calculation, his faith that people could be better than they were. I hated him for it, and I killed him for it, and I'll carry that sin into whatever comes next. But I don't want to die with hatred being the last thing I offer. So here's the truth, Lydia. You were the best thing that ever happened to my brother. You made him happy in a way I never understood and could never achieve. The children, those orphans you both took in, they were proof that love is more powerful than blood, more binding than law, more real than any of the things I spent my life chasing. I can't undo what I've done. I can't bring Samuel back or heal the wounds I've inflicted. But I can give you one final gift. Peace. I have destroyed all records of my claims against you and the children. I have withdrawn all pending legal actions, and I have instructed my lawyers to transfer the remainder of the Rowe estate, whatever Caleb's portion would have been, to you and your family. It won't balance the scales. Nothing could. But perhaps it will help you build the life that Samuel wanted for all of you. Tell the children I'm sorry. Tell Thomas that his testimony at the trial was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed. Tell them all that even at the end, even in the darkest part of my soul, I recognized what they were. Not orphans, not property, not burdens, but miracles. Every single one of them. Caleb Jonathan Rowe. Lydia's hands were shaking so badly that the paper nearly fell. Elias took it from her gently and set it aside, then gathered her into his arms. "It's over," he said. "It's really over." "I don't know what to feel," she whispered. "I wanted him to face justice. I wanted him to hang for what he did. But this is still justice. A different kind, maybe, but justice nonetheless. He transferred the estate, the money, all of it. That doesn't change what he did. No, but it changes what we can do." She pulled back to look at him, and in her eyes he saw something new, a vision taking shape, a dream growing into possibility. Elias, do you know what we could do with that money? We could help other children. We could build something, a refuge, a home for orphans like ours. We could honor Samuel's memory by carrying on his work. That's a big dream. It's a big estate. Despite everything, she was smiling now. We could do so much good. We could save so many children. Isn't that what Samuel would have wanted? Elias looked at her, this woman who had lost so much, suffered so much, fought so hard, and felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name. Yes, he said, I think that's exactly what Samuel would have wanted. The funeral was small and private. Not Caleb's funeral. That was handled by his lawyers, attended by no one. But a memorial service for Samuel, held in the little church in Reed's Crossing 2 weeks after they returned to the ranch. Pastor Hart presided, his voice strong and clear as he spoke about a man he had barely known but deeply admired. Samuel Rowe believed that family is not about blood, the pastor said. He believed that love is the only bond that truly matters. He gave his life defending that belief. And because of his sacrifice, 7 children will grow up knowing that they are valued, that they are loved, that they belong. The children sat in the front pew, clean and solemn in their best clothes. Thomas had his arm around Emma, who was crying softly. The twins held hands, their faces mirror images of grief and hope. Marcus sat very straight, his dark eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. Matthew had 1,000 questions that he was, for once, keeping to himself. And little Peter, the boy who had wandered alone on the prairie, the boy who still couldn't speak of whatever horrors had driven him there, reached out and took Lydia's hand, holding it tightly as if he would never let go. After the service, they walked together to the churchyard, where a small stone had been placed in Samuel's memory. There was no body to bury. Samuel's remains had been lost somewhere on the Montana plains, but the stone gave them a place to grieve, a focal point for the mourning that had been delayed too long. I wish you could have met him, Lydia said quietly, standing beside Elias before the stone. You would have liked him. He was kind, gentle, nothing like his brother. I feel like I know him, Elias replied. Through you, through the children, through everything you've told me about the man he was. He would have approved of you, I think. He would have been glad that I found someone who loves the children as much as he did. I do love them. All of them. Elias hesitated, then continued. And I love you, Lydia. I know I've said it before, but I want you to hear it again, here, in front of Samuel. I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring everything he believed in. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder. I know, that's why I chose you. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children gathered around them, and for a moment they were all connected, a family forged in loss and love, standing together at the end of one story and the beginning of another. The formal adoption proceedings began the following month. It was a complicated process, made more so by the fact that none of the children had proper documentation. No birth certificates, no records of previous guardianship, nothing to prove who they were or where they had come from. But Henry Marsh, who had stayed on to help with the legal aftermath of Caleb's death, proved to be as skilled at navigating adoption law as he had been at criminal prosecution. The territory is sympathetic, he reported after a meeting with the judge who would be handling the case. Everyone's heard the story. The newspapers have made you famous, the woman who stood up to a murderer, the rancher who gave refuge to orphans, the children who testified to bring a killer to justice. Judge Warren has indicated that he's inclined to approve the adoption with minimal obstacles. All 6 of them? Lydia asked. All 6. Marsh smiled. Though technically, Thomas is old enough to be considered an adult by some standards. The judge has suggested that rather than a formal adoption, you might consider appointing him as a legal ward until he comes of age. It would give him more autonomy while still keeping him under your protection. What does Thomas want? I want to stay, Thomas said. He had been listening from the doorway, and now he stepped into the room with the quiet confidence that had characterized him from the beginning. I want to be part of this family. I don't care what the legal terms are. Ward, adopted son, whatever, as long as I'm here. as long as I belong." Lydia crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "You'll always belong, Thomas, no matter what any piece of paper says." The adoption was finalized on a clear spring day, with the snow finally beginning to melt and the first hints of green appearing on the hillsides. Judge Warren signed the documents in his chambers, officially making Emma, Marcus, Rachel, Rebecca, Matthew, and Peter the legal children of Lydia Rowe McCord and Elias McCord. Thomas, as agreed, became their ward, though in every way that mattered, he was their son too. "Congratulations," the judge said, shaking their hands. "You've got quite a family there." "We do," Elias agreed. "The best family in Montana." That evening, they celebrated with a dinner that Mrs. Patterson insisted on preparing, even though they'd been back at the ranch for weeks. She arrived with baskets of food and a warmth that had become familiar, and soon the cabin was filled with noise and laughter and the kind of joyful chaos that had become the soundtrack of their lives. "A toast," Pastor Hart said, raising his glass of apple cider. Elias had no alcohol in the house, not with children present. "To the McCord family, to the triumph of love over darkness, and to the future that lies ahead. May it be brighter than any of us can imagine." "To the McCord family," everyone echoed. And sitting around that crowded table, surrounded by the people he loved, Elias McCord felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not since Margaret's death, not since he'd given up on life and retreated into his grief. He felt grateful. Grateful for the storm that had driven a wounded woman and 7 children into his barn. Grateful for the courage that had allowed him to help them. Grateful for the battle they had fought together, the victory they had won, and the family they had become. For the first time in years, Lydia slept without fear. She hadn't even realized how much fear had been woven into her dreams until it was gone. But that night, after the celebration had ended and the children were asleep and she lay in Elias's arms in the darkness of their bedroom, she felt something loosen inside her, a knot that had been tied so long she'd forgotten what it was like to breathe without it. "What are you thinking about?" Elias murmured, his voice drowsy with approaching sleep. "I'm thinking about how strange it is. To be happy, to feel safe, to know that tomorrow will come, and the day after that, and the day after that, and none of them will bring danger or fear or the shadow of Caleb Rowe. You deserve to feel safe. You've earned it. So have you, so have the children." She nestled closer to him, feeling his warmth, his solidity, his presence. "I never thought I'd have this again. After Samuel died, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd spend whatever time I had left just surviving, just keeping the children alive until they were old enough to take care of themselves. And now? Now I want to live. Really live. I want to watch those children grow up. I want to build that refuge for orphans we talked about. I want to grow old with you, Elias. I want everything." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Then we'll have everything. Together." She fell asleep in his arms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her dreams were filled with light. The wedding was held at the ranch beneath the cottonwood trees that Margaret McCord had planted in the first year of her marriage to Elias. It was a simple ceremony, just the family, Pastor Hart, Sheriff Brooks, and his wife, Mrs. Patterson, Miss Prudence Walker, who had become an unexpected ally, and a handful of townspeople who had become friends during the long months of trials and tribulations. Lydia wore a dress of pale blue cotton, new, not mended, and carried wildflowers that the children had gathered from the hillsides. Elias wore the suit he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, though this time it felt different. This time it felt like hope instead of grief. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the words that Pastor Hart spoke before them were unique to this moment, this family, this story. "Marriage," the pastor said, "is more than a contract between two people. It is a promise to build something together, a home, a family, a life. Lydia and Elias have already built that life, forged in the fires of adversity and strengthened by the love they share for each other and for the children who stand here with them today. What we do now is simply give a name to what already exists. We call it marriage. We call it family. We call it love." When Elias kissed his bride beneath the cottonwood trees, with the Montana wind rustling the leaves and 7 children cheering around them, he felt Margaret's presence, not as a ghost, not as a grief, but as a blessing, a benediction from beyond, a whispered assurance that he was not betraying her memory by loving again, but honoring it. And when Lydia looked into his eyes and whispered, "I love you," he knew that the long journey was finally over. They had found their way home. The first spring on the ranch as a family arrived like a promise fulfilled. The snow melted slowly, reluctantly, as if winter itself was loath to release its grip on the Montana landscape. But bit by bit, day by day, the white blanket receded, revealing the brown earth beneath. And then, almost magically, the first hints of green began to appear. Tiny shoots pushed through the soil. Buds swelled on the cottonwood branches. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, frozen solid for months, began to murmur and gurgle as the ice broke apart and the water remembered how to flow. And with the spring came new life in every sense of the word. Lydia stood on the porch of the cabin, their cabin now, hers and Elias's and the children's, watching the sun rise over the Beartooth Mountains. The light caught the peaks and turned them gold, then pink, then a brilliant white that made her eyes water. She had seen 100 sunrises in her life, maybe 1,000, but none of them had ever looked like this. None of them had ever felt like hope made visible. "You're up early." She turned to find Elias behind her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, his hair still sleep-tousled and his eyes soft with the particular tenderness he reserved for early mornings. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, taking one of the cups. "Too much to think about." "Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" "Good thoughts. All good thoughts." She took a sip of the coffee, strong and bitter the way he always made it, and leaned against his shoulder. "I was thinking about Samuel, about how much he would have loved this. The ranch, the children, the life we're building. He had such dreams, Elias, such beautiful dreams about what was possible. We're living those dreams now. That's not nothing." "I know. I just wish he could see it." She was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Do you think he can? Wherever he is? Do you think he knows?" "I think—" Elias paused, considering. "I think that the people we love never really leave us. They live on in the things we do, the choices we make, the love we carry forward. Samuel lives in those children. He lives in the refuge we're building. He lives in the way you smile when you watch Emma chase butterflies or hear Peter laugh. Maybe he can't see it the way we see it, but I think he knows. Somehow, I think he knows." Lydia blinked back tears. "When did you become so wise?" "Probably around the time a half-frozen woman pointed a gun at me in my own barn." She laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and the sound seemed to carry across the valley, mixing with the birdsong and the whisper of the wind through the new grass. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Now come inside. The children will be up soon, and someone needs to make breakfast." The children woke gradually, as they always did, emerging from their rooms in various states of alertness. Thomas was first, as always. At 14 now, he had taken on the unofficial role of eldest brother with a seriousness that sometimes made Elias's heart ache. The boy had seen too much, lost too much, grown up too fast. But he was also finding his way back to something like childhood, slowly and tentatively, learning that it was safe to laugh and play and dream. The twins came next, Rachel and Rebecca moving in their usual perfect synchronization. At 11, they had developed distinct personalities that made it easier to tell them apart. Rachel was the talker, the planner, the one who always had an opinion about everything, while Rebecca was quieter, more observant, content to let her sister take the lead while she watched and listened and thought her own private thoughts. Marcus stumbled out, rubbing his eyes, his 10-year-old dignity somewhat compromised by the spectacular bedhead he was sporting. He'd grown 2 inches since they'd arrived at the ranch, and his face had lost some of its wariness, though there were still moments when the shadows of his past crossed his features like clouds blocking the sun. Matthew, at 9, was already chattering before he was fully awake, peppering Lydia with questions about what they were having for breakfast, whether they could go fishing later, and did she know that birds were descended from dinosaurs? He'd read it in a book that Pastor Hart had lent him. 8-year-old Emma came running down the stairs with her usual exuberance, her blonde hair flying behind her, her face bright with the particular joy of a child who has finally learned that mornings can be safe. She threw herself at Lydia with abandon, wrapping her arms around her waist and holding on tight. "Good morning, sweetheart," Lydia murmured, stroking her hair. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about the baby horses," Emma said. "The ones Mr. Harmon is bringing next week. I dreamed they let me ride them. You'll have to wait until they're bigger for that, but you can help name them, if you like." "Really? Can I really?" "Really and truly." And finally, little Peter, 5 years old now, no longer quite so little, emerged from the room he shared with Matthew, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had become his constant companion. He didn't say anything. Peter still spoke rarely, his words precious commodities doled out only when absolutely necessary, but he made his way to Elias and tugged on his trouser leg until Elias picked him up. "Good morning, little man," Elias said, settling the boy on his hip. "Ready for breakfast?" Peter nodded solemnly, and Elias carried him to the kitchen, where the smell of bacon was already beginning to fill the air. This was their life now. This was their family. The refuge had been Lydia's idea, but it quickly became a shared dream. They called it Haven Ranch, and the construction began that spring with money from the Rowe estate and labor from townspeople who had heard the story and wanted to help. The plan was ambitious: a large dormitory building that could house up to 20 children, a schoolhouse where they could learn reading and writing and arithmetic, a workshop where older children could learn trades, and of course the working ranch itself, where everyone would contribute according to their abilities. "You're trying to do too much at once," Miss Prudence Walker warned during one of her increasingly frequent visits to the ranch. The sharp-tongued old woman had become an unlikely ally, her disapproval transformed into fierce protectiveness once she'd learned the truth about Lydia and the children. "Rome wasn't built in a day, you know." "I know," Lydia said, "but every day we wait is another day that children are suffering. Children like ours were. Children with no one to protect them, no one to love them, no one to give them a chance." "The world is full of suffering, Mrs. McCord. You can't save everyone." "No, but I can save some, and some is better than none." Miss Walker was quiet for a moment, studying Lydia with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "You remind me of myself," she said. "When I was young, before I learned to be cautious." "What happened?" "Life, loss, the 1,000 small defeats that teach us to protect ourselves." The old woman's voice softened. "But perhaps I was wrong to learn those lessons so well. Perhaps there's wisdom in refusing to give up on impossible dreams. Does that mean you'll help us?" "It means I'll stop trying to talk you out of it. And it means—" She hesitated, then continued, "It means I have some money set aside, money I was saving for— Well, it doesn't matter what I was saving it for. I'd like to contribute to your Haven Ranch if you'll allow it." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Miss Walker, don't get sentimental on me, girl. It's just money. And call me Prudence. If we're going to be partners in this foolishness, we might as well use first names." The dormitory was finished by midsummer, a sturdy building of local timber with room for 20 beds, a common area with a large fireplace, and windows that looked out over the valley toward the mountains. The schoolhouse followed shortly after, and then the workshop, and then, piece by piece, building by building, Haven Ranch began to take shape. The first orphans arrived in August. There were 3 of them, siblings, 2 boys and a girl, found wandering the streets of Billings after their parents died in a mining accident. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 6, and they clung to each other with the desperate intensity of children who had learned that the only thing they could rely on was each other. Lydia met them at the door of the dormitory, remembering how terrified her own children had been when they'd first arrived at Elias's ranch. She knelt down to their level, her voice soft and gentle. "Hello," she said. "My name is Lydia. Welcome to Haven Ranch." The oldest, a boy named William, looked at her with suspicious eyes. "Are you going to separate us?" "No, absolutely not. You're family. Family stays together." "Promise?" "I promise." Something shifted in the boy's face. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the armor of wariness he'd built around himself. "This is my brother James," he said, gesturing to the middle child, "and my sister Sarah. It's nice to meet all of you. Would you like to see your new home?" She led them through the dormitory, showing them the beds that had been prepared for them, the chest where they could keep their belongings, the common area with its comfortable chairs and shelves of books. Emma trailed behind them, watching the new arrivals with the particular intensity of a child who recognized something of herself in their frightened faces. "I was scared too," Emma told Sarah, who was clutching a ragged doll that had clearly seen better days. "When I first came here. But it's safe now. Nobody will hurt you. Mrs. Lydia won't let them." Sarah looked at her new home, at the clean beds and the warm fire, and the woman who had knelt to greet her at eye level, and something in her small face relaxed. "Really?" she whispered. "Really and truly," Emma said, echoing the words that Lydia had spoken to her so many times. "You'll see." The summer passed in a blur of activity. More children arrived, some brought by the Territorial Orphan Society, others found by Sheriff Brooks during his travels, still others delivered by Pastor Hart, who had taken to seeking out abandoned and neglected children with the fervor of a man on a holy mission. By September, there were 12 children living at Haven Ranch, not counting the original 7 McCord children, and the dormitory that had seemed so large in the spring was beginning to feel crowded. "We need to expand," Lydia said one evening, poring over the accounts at the kitchen table. "Another dormitory at least, maybe 2. "We can afford it," Elias said, looking over her shoulder. "The Rowe estate was larger than we thought, and the ranch is turning a profit for the first time in years. It's not just about money, it's about people. We need more help, teachers, caretakers, people who can give these children the attention they deserve." "What about Martha Simmons?" Lydia looked up. "Caleb's former housekeeper?" "She came forward when it mattered. She risked her own safety to bring us the evidence we needed. And she's been writing to you, hasn't she, asking about the children?" "She has." Lydia was quiet for a moment, considering. She always said she felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. Maybe this would give her a chance to make amends. "It's worth asking." Martha Simmons arrived at Haven Ranch 3 weeks later, her modest luggage containing everything she owned in the world. She was a different woman than the one who had stood up in that courtroom and changed the course of the trial, older, somehow, and more worn, as if the weight of her testimony had taken something from her, even as it had freed Lydia and the children. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice uncertain. "I know I have no right to be here, not after everything I failed to do." "You're here now," Lydia said gently. "That's what matters." "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have told someone what Caleb was planning. If I had, Samuel might still be alive. Those children might never have had to suffer. Or things might have turned out exactly the same, or worse." Lydia took her hand. "We can't change the past, Martha. We can only do better in the present. And there are children here who need someone to love them, to teach them, to help them heal. Can you do that?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I can try." "Then that's enough. That's more than enough." Fall came quickly, and with it came the harvest. The ranch had produced more than anyone expected: vegetables from the garden Lydia had planted, grain from the fields Elias had sown, meat from the cattle that had weathered the winter and thrived in the spring. There was more than enough to feed the children and the staff, with plenty left over to sell in town or donate to those in need. The children helped with the harvest, even the youngest ones, learning the satisfaction of honest work and the pride of contributing to something larger than themselves. Thomas supervised the older boys in the fields, his natural leadership finding an outlet that didn't require him to be constantly vigilant for danger. The twins organized the kitchen, preserving vegetables and baking bread and preparing meals for the growing household. Marcus discovered a talent for working with animals and spent hours in the barn, caring for the horses and cattle with a gentleness that surprised everyone who remembered the sullen, suspicious boy he'd been. And through it all, Lydia watched her family grow and change and heal. She watched Emma teach the younger orphans how to play the games she'd learned, her fear of strangers gradually fading as she discovered the joy of being a big sister. She watched Matthew share his books with children who had never owned a book in their lives, his endless questions finally finding others who wanted to learn alongside him. She watched Peter slowly, tentatively begin to speak more. Not much, never much, but enough to let them know he was there, that he was healing, that the wounds of his mysterious past were beginning to close. And she watched Thomas, her firstborn in every way that mattered, begin to transform from a boy into a young man. He turned 15 that fall, and Elias marked the occasion with a gift that made the boy's eyes go wide, a horse of his own, a young mare with a chestnut coat and a gentle temperament. "She's yours," Elias said. "To train, to ride, to care for, a man needs a horse in this country." "Sir, Thomas stopped, overcome. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You've earned it. You've more than earned it." That night, after the birthday celebration had ended and the children were in bed, Lydia found Thomas sitting on the porch, looking out at the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Too much to think about." "Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" He smiled at the familiar question. "Good thoughts. Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. McCord? Lydia, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you think Mr. Samuel would be proud of us? Of everything we've built here?" Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I think he would be prouder than words can say. I think he would look at you, at all of you, and see everything he ever dreamed was possible. I think about him sometimes, about what he said, about family being about love, not blood. I didn't really understand it then. I was just a kid. But now," he gestured at the dormitory, the schoolhouse, the buildings that represented so much hope. "Now I think I do." "Family is what you choose," Lydia said softly. "It's the people you love, the people who love you, the bonds you build through shared struggle and shared joy." Samuel understood that, and because of him, because of what he believed and fought for, dozens of children will grow up knowing that they're not alone, that they matter, that they're loved. Thomas nodded slowly. "I want to be like him. I want to help build something that matters, something that lasts." "You already are, Thomas. You already are." Winter came again, but this time it felt different. The cold was just as bitter, the snow just as deep, but the cabin that had once echoed with loneliness was now bursting with life. There were too many people to fit around a single table, so they ate in shifts, the children laughing and talking and arguing the way families do. There were too many voices to track, too many stories being told at once, too much noise and chaos and beautiful, wonderful mess, and Lydia loved every moment of it. She loved the early mornings when she woke in Elias's arms and listened to the sounds of children stirring, knowing that they were safe, that they were warm, that they were loved. She loved the long afternoons teaching lessons in the schoolhouse, watching young minds light up with understanding. She loved the quiet evenings by the fire, mending clothes or reading stories or simply sitting in the presence of the people who had become her family. But most of all, she loved the moments of unexpected grace, the times when the universe seemed to pause and let her glimpse something larger than herself. One such moment came on a particularly cold night in January, almost exactly a year after she and the children had stumbled into Elias's barn. She had gone out to check on the livestock, a habit she'd developed during those long months of running, when constant vigilance was the only thing keeping them alive, and found herself standing in the middle of the yard, looking up at the stars. They were magnificent, thousands upon thousands of them, scattered across the black velvet sky like diamonds flung by a careless god. The Milky Way stretched overhead, a river of light that seemed to flow from one horizon to the other. And in the silence and the cold and the overwhelming beauty of it all, Lydia felt something shift inside her. She thought about all the paths that had led her here, the choices made and unmade, the tragedies endured, the miracles witnessed. She thought about Samuel, who had loved her and died for that love. She thought about Caleb, whose hatred had nearly destroyed them all. She thought about the children, each one a universe of possibility, each one a life saved from darkness. And she thought about Elias, this man who had opened his door to strangers, who had risked everything to protect people he didn't know, who had loved her back to life when she'd forgotten how to live. "Penny, for your thoughts." She turned to find him standing behind her, wrapped in his heavy coat, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I was thinking about how strange life is," she said, "how something that seems like the worst thing that could ever happen can turn out to be the beginning of everything good. The storm that drove you into my barn? Among other things." She moved closer to him, seeking his warmth. If Caleb hadn't done what he did, if Samuel hadn't died, I never would have found you. The children never would have found this home. None of this would exist. Are you saying you're grateful to Caleb? No, never. What he did was evil, and I'll never forgive him for it. She paused, searching for words. But I've learned that even evil can plant seeds of good, if good people are willing to tend them. Samuel's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't meaningless. It led to something that matters, something that will outlast all of us. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Margaret used to say something similar. She used to say that God writes straight with crooked lines, that even the worst parts of our stories can lead to something beautiful, if we let them. Do you believe that? I didn't. For a long time after she died, I didn't believe in anything except grief. But now, he looked at the stars, at the ranch, at the woman standing beside him. Now I think maybe she was right. Maybe everything that happened, all the loss, all the pain, all the darkness, maybe it was all leading here, to this moment, to this life, to you. She rose on her toes and kissed him, her lips cold against his warm ones, her heart full of an emotion too large for words. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. He pulled her close. Now come inside before we both freeze to death. We've got a family to take care of. Spring came again, and with it came growth. Haven Ranch expanded to accommodate more children. 2 new dormitories, a larger schoolhouse, a proper medical clinic staffed by a doctor who had heard about their work and wanted to contribute. The territorial government, impressed by what they had accomplished, began sending regular support. Not much, but enough to help cover expenses and hire additional staff. And the children kept coming. They came from mining camps and frontier towns, from broken families and no families at all. They came starving and sick and scared, their eyes holding the same desperate hope that Lydia remembered seeing in her own children's faces all those months ago. And one by one, they were welcomed, cared for, loved, back to wholeness. Some of them stayed forever, growing up at Haven Ranch and eventually becoming staff members themselves, contributing to the work that had saved them. Others stayed only until they were old enough to make their own way in the world, leaving with skills and education and the knowledge that they mattered, that they had value, that they were loved. Every child was a victory. Every life saved was a triumph over the darkness that had tried to swallow them all. The first wedding at Haven Ranch took place in the spring of 1892, 5 years after Lydia had stumbled into Elias's barn. Thomas McCord, no longer a boy but a young man of 20 with his father's height and his mother's fierce determination, married a young woman named Clara, the daughter of one of the doctors who worked at the clinic. They had met when Clara came to visit her father and found Thomas in the barn, gentling a skittish horse with the patience and skill he'd developed over years of practice. "She's beautiful," Claire had said, watching the horse finally calm under Thomas's hands. "She's scared," Thomas replied. "Someone hurt her before she came here. She doesn't trust easily. But you're helping her. I'm trying. Sometimes that's all you can do. Try. And keep trying, even when it seems impossible." Clara had looked at him then, really looked at him, and seen something that made her want to keep trying too. The wedding was held beneath the cottonwood trees, just as Lydia and Elias's had been, with Pastor Hart presiding and the entire Haven Ranch community gathered to celebrate. The bride wore white, the groom wore his best suit, and when they exchanged their vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. "I remember when you first came to us," Lydia said during her toast, her voice thick with emotion. "You were a scared, suspicious, angry boy who had seen too much death and lost too much love. But even then, there was something in you, a strength, a determination, a capacity for caring that wouldn't be broken. You saved us, Thomas. Time and time again, you saved us. And now you found someone to share your life with, someone to build a future with. Your father, both your fathers, would be so proud." Thomas rose and embraced her, holding her tight the way he had on that terrible night in the barn when everything had seemed hopeless. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." "You made it easy," she whispered back. "You've always made it easy." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own triumphs and challenges. Marcus grew up to become a veterinarian, his gift with animals finding its fullest expression in a career that allowed him to heal the creatures he loved. He married a woman from town and built a house on the edge of the Haven Ranch property, close enough to help with the work that had shaped him. The twins, Rachel and Rebecca, took over the management of the ranch's domestic operations, their complementary skills, Rachel's organizational genius, Rebecca's quiet compassion, making them invaluable to the growing institution. Rachel married eventually, but Rebecca chose to remain single, dedicating herself entirely to the children who needed her. Matthew became a teacher, his endless curiosity finding an outlet in a profession that allowed him to share his love of learning with others. He traveled to Chicago to earn his credentials, then returned to Haven Ranch to establish a proper school that became known throughout the territory for its excellence. Emma, the little girl who had clung to Lydia's hand on that first terrifying night, grew into a beautiful young woman with a gift for music that seemed to come from somewhere divine. She trained in San Francisco and returned to Montana to give concerts that raised money for Haven Ranch, her voice carrying the story of her survival to audiences who wept and applauded in equal measure. And Peter, the silent, wounded child who had been found wandering alone on the prairie, slowly, year by year, found his voice. He never became talkative, never lost the watchful quietness that was his nature, but he became a writer, his words flowing onto paper with a power and beauty that seemed impossible for someone who had spent so long unable to speak. His first book, published when he was 25, told the story of a boy who had lost everything and found a family that taught him what love meant. It became a sensation, read by thousands of people who saw their own struggles reflected in its pages. Through it all, Lydia and Elias remained at the center, older now, grayer, slower, but no less devoted to the work they had begun. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by family, not just the 7 children they had adopted, but their spouses, their children, the dozens of former orphans who considered Haven Ranch their home. The party spilled out of the cabin and across the yard, filling the space with laughter and music and the particular joy of people who have been through darkness together and emerged into light. "Look at this," Elias said, standing with Lydia on the porch, watching their extended family celebrate. "Look at what you built." "What we built," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You would have found a way. You always find a way." She leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body, the strength of his presence, the love that had sustained her through decades of joy and sorrow. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "In the barn when I was pointing a gun at your chest?" "I said a lot of things that night. I was trying not to get shot." "You said you weren't going to let anyone else die on your land. I remember." "I didn't believe you. I'd stopped believing anyone could be trusted, anyone could be safe. But you proved me wrong. You proved me wrong every single day for 25 years. And I'll keep proving you wrong for 25 more. Promise?" He turned her to face him, cupping her face in his hands the way he had on so many occasions, his eyes full of the same love that had saved her all those years ago. "I promise," he said, "today, tomorrow, forever." She kissed him then, in front of their family and their friends and their children, not caring who saw, not caring about propriety or dignity or any of the things that had once seemed so important. This was her life. This was her family. This was the home she had built from the ashes of tragedy and the seeds of hope. And it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. The final chapter came on a quiet evening in autumn, many years later. Lydia was old now, truly old, her hair white as Montana snow, her body frail in ways it had never been before. She spent most of her days in the rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the endless activity of Haven Ranch with eyes that still sparkled with the fierce intelligence that had defined her. Elias had passed 3 years earlier, peacefully, in his sleep, with Lydia's hand in his and their children gathered around them. She missed him every day, missed his voice, his warmth, his unwavering presence at her side. But she also felt him everywhere she looked, in the cottonwood trees they had planted together, in the faces of the children who had become their legacy, in the very air of this place that they had built from nothing but love and determination. Thomas came to visit every day, bringing his grandchildren, Lydia's great-grandchildren, to sit at her feet and listen to stories about the old days. The others visited too, when they could. Marcus with his veterinary bag and his gentle hands, the twins with their organizational spreadsheets and their warm hugs, Matthew with his books and his endless questions, Emma with her music and her light, Peter with his quiet presence and his profound silence that said more than most people's words. And the orphans, the hundreds of children who had passed through Haven Ranch over the decades, they came too. They came from all over the territory, from all over the country, to pay their respects to the woman who had saved them, who had loved them, who had given them a chance when no one else would. On the last day, Lydia gathered her family around her. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice thin but clear. "Something I've been thinking about for a long time." "What is it, Mother?" Thomas asked, using the name he had called her for decades, the name that still made her heart swell with love. "When I walked into Elias's barn all those years ago, I was ready to die. I had given up on everything, hope, love, the future. All I wanted was to protect you children for as long as I could, and then I didn't care what happened to me." The room was silent, her family listening with the particular intensity of people who know they are hearing something sacred. But Elias wouldn't let me give up. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He saw someone worth saving. And when he saved me, he taught me the most important lesson of my life. "What lesson?" Emma asked softly. Lydia smiled, the same smile that had comforted frightened children, encouraged struggling students, welcomed orphans to their new home for more than 30 years. "That love is stronger than fear. That hope is stronger than despair. That even in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, there is always, always a chance for something beautiful to grow." She reached out and took Thomas's hand. "You children were that beautiful thing for me. Haven Ranch was that beautiful thing. This family, all of you, you're the proof that even the most terrible tragedy can lead to something worth living for." Tears were falling freely now, running down the faces of the people she loved most in the world. "Don't cry," she said gently. "This isn't sad. This is the end of a story that turned out better than I ever could have imagined. I'm going to see Elias again. I'm going to see Samuel. I'm going to be with the people I've lost, while the people I love carry on the work we started together." "We will," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll carry it on. We'll make sure Haven Ranch survives for generations. We'll make sure everything you built lasts forever." "I know you will." She squeezed his hand. "I've always known. From the moment I met you, I knew you were destined for something extraordinary. All of you are. All of you have been." She closed her eyes then, and her family gathered close, holding her hands and stroking her hair and telling her they loved her, that they would never forget her, that everything she had done would live on in them and their children and their children's children. And as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lydia Rowe McCord took her final breath. She died as she had lived, surrounded by love, sustained by hope, at peace with everything she had done and everything she had been. The funeral was the largest the territory had ever seen. People came from hundreds of miles away, former orphans, now grown with families of their own, townspeople who remembered the fierce woman who had stood up to a murderer, strangers who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. The church in Reed's Crossing couldn't hold them all, so the service was held outdoors, beneath the cottonwood trees where Lydia and Elias had been married so many years before. Pastor Hart's successor spoke of her courage, her compassion, her unwavering commitment to the children no one else wanted. Thomas spoke of the mother who had saved him from certain death and taught him what it meant to be part of a family. Emma sang, her voice carrying across the valley, the song she had written for the woman who had given her everything. And when it was over, they laid Lydia to rest beside Elias, beneath a simple stone that bore both their names and the dates of their lives. Below the names, at Thomas's suggestion, they carved a single phrase, the words that had defined everything they had built together. Family is love. Haven Ranch continued for generations. Long after Thomas and Clara passed away, long after the original McCord children had all gone to their rest, the work they had started lived on. The buildings grew and changed, modern improvements replacing the original structures, but the spirit remained the same. Children who had nowhere else to go found a home. Lives that seemed hopeless found purpose. Love that seemed impossible found a way to bloom. And every year, on the anniversary of Lydia's death, the entire Haven Ranch community gathered beneath the cottonwood trees for a remembrance ceremony. They told stories about the woman who had started it all, the bleeding stranger who had stumbled into a rancher's barn on the coldest night of the year, the mother who had adopted 7 children and then went on to save hundreds more, the wife who had found love again after loss and built something that would outlast them all. They spoke of courage and hope and the stubborn refusal to give up, even when everything seemed impossible. They spoke of Elias McCord, the widower who had opened his door to strangers and found a reason to live again. They spoke of the children, Thomas and Emma and Marcus and the twins and Matthew and Peter, who had survived horrors that would have broken most adults and gone on to change the world. And they spoke of love, the love that had started it all, the love that had sustained them through darkness, the love that continued to grow and spread and multiply long after its original vessels had returned to the earth. Because in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered. Not the money or the buildings or the legal victories, not the reputation or the recognition or the praise. Just love. Love that had found a bleeding woman and 7 children in a frozen barn. Love that had stood against a murderer and refused to back down. Love that had built a home for the homeless, a family for the forgotten, a future for those who had none. Love that had changed Montana, and would continue changing it, one child at a time, for as long as there were children who needed saving and people brave enough to save them. This was Lydia's legacy. This was Elias's gift. This was the story of Haven Ranch, a story that began with tragedy and ended with triumph, a story that proved what was possible when good people refused to give up on each other, a story of fear finally having nowhere left to live, a story of home. The end.